The night Lily Cole took her first step in 11 years, the world wasn't watching. No cameras, no headlines. Just a broken-down garage in coastal California, a desperate mother, and a man everyone had forgotten. A mechanic who'd been studying the human body like it was just another engine to fix. What happened in those final 60 seconds would either destroy 3 lives or prove that miracles don't need million-dollar labs. They just need someone who refuses to quit. This is that story. Hit subscribe, drop a comment with your city, and let me show you how far hope can walk when given the chance. The sun hung low over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep violet as it began its slow descent toward the horizon. The air smelled of salt and motor oil, a combination that had become as familiar to Ethan Hale as his own reflection. His garage sat on the forgotten edge of Oceanside, California, wedged between a shuttered fish processing plant and a storage facility where dreams went to gather dust. The building itself seemed to sag under the weight of time. Corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, windows so grimy they turned sunlight into something dim and apologetic. Inside, Ethan worked beneath a 1987 Ford pickup, his calloused hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from years of repetition. Oil dripped onto the concrete floor, adding to the constellation of stains that mapped out decades of other people's problems. He was 38 but looked older, the kind of weathering that happens when life takes more than it gives. His dark hair, flecked with premature gray, fell across his forehead as he twisted a wrench, coaxing a stubborn bolt free. "Dad?" A small voice cut through the metallic clanging. Ethan slid out from under the truck, his worn creeper groaning against the concrete. His daughter, Sophie, stood in the doorway, connecting the garage to their small apartment above. She was 7 years old, all wild curls and bright eyes that still held the kind of wonder he'd lost somewhere along the way. "Yeah, sweetheart? Is it dinner time yet? I finished my homework." He glanced at the clock mounted on the far wall, 6:47 p.m. The day had slipped away from him again, swallowed by carburetors and timing belts, and the endless parade of vehicles that limped through his doors seeking resurrection. "Give me 10 minutes. I just need to finish this oil change." Sophie nodded, but she didn't leave. Instead, she wandered over to his workbench, her small fingers tracing the edge of a notebook that lay open among the scattered tools. The pages were filled with sketches, detailed anatomical drawings of joints, muscles, skeletal structures. Notes crowded the margins in Ethan's tight handwriting, observations about angles and leverage points, calculations that had nothing to do with engine repair. "What's this one?" she asked, pointing to a diagram of a knee joint. Ethan pulled himself upright, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with grease. He walked over and looked down at the drawing, seeing it through her curious eyes. "That's how your leg bends," he said softly. "See these? Those are ligaments. They hold the bones together but still let you move. It's kind of like a really complicated hinge." "Like on a door?" "Smarter than a door. A door only swings one way. Your knee can bend, twist a little, absorb impact when you jump. It's engineering that's way better than anything humans have built." Sophie studied the drawing with the seriousness of someone much older. "Is this for Uncle Danny?" The question hit him like a fist to the chest, even though it shouldn't have. Danny had been gone for 3 years now, his younger brother, paralyzed from a car accident, who'd lived the last 2 years of his life in Ethan's care before pneumonia took what the accident couldn't. But Sophie remembered. She remembered Ethan spending nights reading medical journals, sketching designs for braces and supports, trying to find some way to give Danny back even a fraction of what he'd lost. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "It started with Uncle Danny." "But you still do it, even though he's gone." Ethan put a hand on her shoulder. "Because there are other people out there like him, people who still have hope." Sophie looked up at him with those devastating eyes, so much like her mother's that sometimes it hurt to meet her gaze. "Do you think you'll really help someone someday?" It was an innocent question, asked without judgment, but it carried the weight of years. Years of late nights and failed attempts, of textbooks Ethan could barely afford, and equipment he built from salvaged parts. Years of people telling him he was wasting his time, that he was just a mechanic, that real innovation happened in universities and research labs, not in grimy garages that smelled like desperation. "I don't know, Sophie," he admitted, because he'd never lied to her. But I'm going to keep trying. She smiled at that, a small curve of lips that said she believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Then she was gone, padding back upstairs to wait for dinner that would probably be mac and cheese again because it was cheap and filling, and all he had energy to make after 10 hours of work. Ethan stood alone in the garage, surrounded by the mechanical corpses of other people's transportation, and allowed himself a moment of honesty. He was tired, not just physically, though his back ached and his hands were scraped raw. He was tired of the weight of it all, the bills that multiplied faster than he could pay them, the responsibility of raising Sophie alone, the ghost of his wife Claire who'd died bringing their daughter into the world, the memory of Danny wasting away in a hospital bed while Ethan frantically searched for answers that never came. The smart thing would be to give up the research, to accept that he was a mechanic, nothing more, and focus on keeping his business afloat and his daughter fed. The smart thing would be to sell the medical books stacked in the corner, to stop buying anatomy models from eBay, to use those late-night hours for sleep instead of study. But Ethan had made a promise. It was a promise whispered in a hospital room at 2 a.m. while Danny slept fitfully, his broken body unresponsive to everything doctors tried. "I won't give up on you," Ethan had said. "I won't give up on people like you. Not as long as there's hope." Danny never heard that promise. He died 3 days later, drowning in his own lungs while Ethan held his hand and felt like the world's biggest failure. So he kept studying, kept sketching, kept trying to understand the magnificent machinery of the human body with the same dedication he'd once brought to understanding engines. Because maybe, just maybe, if he worked hard enough and learned enough and tried enough times, he could keep that promise to someone who could still benefit from it. The next morning arrived the way it always did, too early and without mercy. Ethan woke to the sound of Sophie moving around upstairs, getting herself ready for school with the independence of a child who'd learned young that her father couldn't do everything. He dragged himself out of bed, made breakfast, walked her to the bus stop 2 blocks away, and returned to open the garage by 7:30. His first customer arrived at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Chen, whose Toyota Camry made a noise like a dying cat every time she turned left. The second was a contractor whose work van needed new brake pads. The third was a kid barely old enough to drive, bringing in a Honda Civic that he'd tried to modify himself and had thoroughly destroyed in the process. This was Ethan's life. This was his reality. Oil changes and brake jobs and diagnostic tests day after day, week after week, year after year. The work was honest and necessary, and it paid just enough to keep the lights on, but it wasn't the life he'd once imagined. There had been a time, before Claire died, when Ethan had been different. He'd been a scholarship student at UC San Diego, studying mechanical engineering, finishing his junior year with a 3.9 GPA and plans to specialize in biomedical engineering. Professors had talked about his potential, about graduate school, about a future building prosthetics and medical devices that could change lives. Then Sophie came early. Complications. Claire hemorrhaging on the delivery table while Ethan sat in the waiting room, helpless. She'd lived long enough to hold their daughter once, to whisper, "Take care of her," before slipping away. Just like that, in the space between one breath and the next, Ethan's future had shattered into something unrecognizable. There was no going back to school, not with a newborn and no life insurance and medical bills that turned into collection notices. Ethan had taken the first job he could find, an apprentice position at a garage owned by a man named Frank, who was gruff but fair. He'd learned quickly, discovered he had a talent for diagnosis and repair, and when Frank retired 5 years later, Ethan had scraped together enough for a down payment on the business. It wasn't engineering, it wasn't saving lives or pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, but it was stable, and stability was what Sophie needed. Except Ethan couldn't quite kill the part of himself that wanted more, that needed to believe his hands could do something beyond routine maintenance. So he studied at night, teaching himself the anatomy and biomechanics that he would have learned in graduate school. He built his knowledge piece by piece, textbook by textbook, sacrificing sleep and social life and any chance at moving beyond the edges of survival. People thought he was crazy. His few remaining friends from college had stopped calling years ago, tired of inviting him to things he could never attend. The other mechanics in town regarded him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Why would anyone waste time on medical research when they could be working on cars or watching football or living a normal life. Even his own father, during their rare phone calls, couldn't hide his disappointment. "You had real potential, Ethan," he'd said the last time they spoke. "You could have been someone." The implication being that he wasn't someone now, just a guy covered in grease, raising a kid alone, pretending he could be more than what life had reduced him to. The morning passed in its familiar rhythm. Ethan diagnosed a failing water pump, replaced a set of spark plugs, and spent 40 minutes trying to explain to an elderly man why his car needed a new catalytic converter, and no, there wasn't a cheaper option that would pass emissions testing. By noon, he was alone in the garage, eating a sandwich he'd made that morning while reviewing his notes on gait analysis. He'd been studying the mechanics of walking for the past 6 months, fascinated by the complexity of something most people never thought about. Every step required coordination between dozens of muscles, perfect timing of contractions and releases, constant micro-adjustments to maintain balance. The human body performed calculations every second that would overwhelm most computers. He was deep in a passage about the role of hip flexors when he heard the sound. A car engine coughing, sputtering, clearly struggling. It grew louder as the vehicle approached, then cut out entirely right in front of his garage. Ethan looked up from his notes to see a car that had no business being in this neighborhood. It was a Mercedes S-Class, current year model, the kind of vehicle that cost more than his garage was worth. Midnight blue with chrome accents, it sat on the street like a very expensive, very out-of-place jewel. The driver's door opened and a woman emerged. She was probably in her mid-40s, dressed in a charcoal gray business suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly revenue. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her face composed in an expression of controlled frustration. Everything about her screamed money and power and the kind of life that happened in boardrooms and country clubs, not on the oil-stained streets of industrial Oceanside. She approached the garage, her heels clicking on the pavement with military precision. Ethan set down his sandwich and stood, suddenly very aware of the grease under his fingernails and the faded Metallica t-shirt he was wearing. "Are you open?" she asked. Her voice was crisp, educated, used to being obeyed. "Yes, ma'am." "What seems to be the problem?" "My car died." "Right there." She gestured toward the Mercedes with barely contained irritation. "I have an extremely important meeting in San Diego in 2 hours, and I cannot miss it." Ethan walked over to examine the car. Even sitting dead, it was beautiful. German engineering at its finest, every line purposeful, every component precisely designed. He felt a familiar tug, the same one he'd felt looking at anatomical drawings. There was artistry in this, a kind of mechanical poetry. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the hood. The woman, he still didn't know her name, nodded impatiently. Ethan popped the hood and leaned in, his trained eyes scanning the engine bay. Modern cars were increasingly electronic, more computer than machine, but the fundamentals remained the same: air, fuel, spark. If it wasn't running, one of those 3 things was failing. He checked the obvious culprits first. Battery connections were tight. Fuel pump was receiving power. Air filter was clean. He pulled a diagnostic tool from his pocket and connected it to the car's computer, scrolling through error codes while the woman watched with the intensity of someone used to demanding answers. "Your mass airflow sensor is reading 0, Ethan said after a moment. "That's why it's not starting. The computer thinks no air is coming in, so it's not injecting fuel." "Can you fix it?" "I can replace it, but I don't have the part in stock. For this model, I'd need to order it, and that'll take..." "How much to get it overnight?" Ethan did quick mental math. "The part is probably $600. Overnight shipping, maybe another $100. Labor, I'll pay whatever it costs. I need this car working by tomorrow morning at the latest." She pulled out a wallet that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly grocery budget and extracted a platinum credit card. No hesitation, no negotiation. Just the casual deployment of resources that people like her used to solve problems. People like him just had to endure. "I'll need to get your information," Ethan said, walking back toward the garage office. The woman followed, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. She glanced around the space with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite disdain, but definitely the look of someone confronting an environment completely foreign to their experience. As Ethan pulled up the parts catalog on his ancient desktop computer, he heard another car door open. He glanced through the grimy window to see someone emerge from the Mercedes's back seat. A girl, probably 16 or 17, was being helped into a wheelchair by a driver who'd stayed silent until now. The wheelchair was state-of-the-art, carbon fiber frame, advanced suspension, the kind of equipment that cost tens of thousands of dollars. But it was what Ethan noticed next that made him stop typing mid-keystroke. The girl's right leg was encased in a brace that ran from her hip to her ankle. It was clearly custom-made, probably by one of the top orthotic manufacturers in the country, with articulated joints at the knee and ankle. But even from this distance, even through a dirty window, Ethan could see something that made his engineer's mind recoil. The alignment was wrong. The knee joint of the brace was positioned slightly posterior to where the natural knee axis should be. It was subtle, maybe 5 millimeters, maybe less, but it was there. And that tiny misalignment would translate into massive forces over time, creating torque on the hip with every attempted movement, making walking not just difficult, but mechanically impossible without pain. He'd seen this before, not in person, but in his studies, in case reports and biomechanical analyses of failed orthotic interventions. It was one of the most common mistakes in brace design, prioritizing stability over natural movement, creating a device that held the limb in position but prevented the body from functioning as it was designed to function. "Is there a problem?" The woman's voice cut through his analysis. Ethan realized he'd been staring. He turned back to the computer, finishing the parts order with hands that had started to shake slightly. "No, sorry, I'll have the part here tomorrow. Should have you running by afternoon." The woman nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "I need a place to work while I wait for my driver to arrive. Do you have Wi-Fi?" "Yeah, password's on the wall there," Ethan said, pointing to a faded sticky note near the window. She pulled out a phone and a laptop from a designer bag, transforming a corner of his grimy office into a makeshift workspace with the efficiency of someone used to working anywhere. Meanwhile, the driver had wheeled the girl inside, parking the wheelchair near the door where she could get some shade. Ethan tried to focus on his work. He really did. There was a transmission rebuild waiting in the back bay, and he'd promised the owner it would be ready by week's end. But his eyes kept drifting to the girl in the wheelchair. She was reading something on a tablet, her expression distant and tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. There was pain there, the kind that had become so constant it was just background noise. Ethan knew that look. He'd seen it on Danny's face for 2 years straight. And that brace, God, that brace. Every time she shifted position, he could see the way it restricted natural movement, the way it forced her body into positions that no human joint was meant to sustain. It was a marvel of materials science and manufacturing, probably cost more than his truck, and it was actively making her condition worse. "Excuse me," he found himself saying before his brain could stop his mouth. "I don't mean to intrude, but may I ask about your daughter's brace?" The woman looked up from her laptop, her expression immediately defensive. "Why?" I noticed the alignment seems a bit off. The knee joint, specifically." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. The woman stood, and Ethan was reminded that while he had 6 inches on her, she had the kind of presence that made height irrelevant. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, her voice quiet and dangerous, "but that brace was designed by Dr. Raymond Chen at Stanford Medical Center. He's one of the foremost orthotic specialists in the country. It cost $47,000 and was precisely calibrated to my daughter's specific anatomy." "I'm sure it was," Ethan said, already regretting opening his mouth. "I didn't mean any offense, You're a mechanic," the woman cut him off. "You fix cars. You don't have any business commenting on medical devices. And you certainly don't have the expertise to question a specialist who's been practicing for 25 years. She was absolutely right, of course. Ethan was a mechanic. He had no credentials, no degree, nothing but late-night studying and a promise made to a dead man. What gave him the right to question the work of actual doctors? But he'd seen what he'd seen, and he couldn't unsee it. "You're right," he said quietly. "I apologize. It wasn't my place." The woman stared at him for a long moment, then returned to her work without another word. The girl in the wheelchair, Ethan still didn't know her name, glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before returning to her tablet. The afternoon crawled past in uncomfortable silence. The woman worked on her laptop, occasionally taking calls in a low, intense voice that spoke of deals and negotiations and numbers that made Ethan's head spin. The girl read or slept or stared at nothing, shifting occasionally in her chair with small movements that Ethan recognized as someone trying to find a position where everything hurt a little less. Around 4 o'clock, a black Escalade pulled up outside. The driver, a different one, apparently this family had multiple, came inside and announced that he was ready to take them to their destination. The woman packed up her things with military efficiency while the driver helped the girl back into the vehicle. Just before leaving, the woman turned back to Ethan. "You'll call me when the car's ready?" "Of course. Should be tomorrow afternoon." She nodded curtly and left, taking with her the strange tension that had filled the garage since her arrival. Ethan stood in the sudden silence, watching through the window as the Escalade pulled away, carrying them back to whatever world they'd come from. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt sick. That night, after Sophie was in bed, Ethan sat at his workbench surrounded by his anatomy books and sketches. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw, reconstructing from memory what he'd seen of the girl's brace. The knee joint, the hip attachment, the ankle articulation. Every detail he could remember. Then he drew what it should have been, where the joints needed to align with natural anatomy, how the forces should distribute during movement, what adjustments would allow the leg to function as it was designed to function, instead of fighting against mechanical constraints that made movement impossible. It was just an exercise, just scratching an intellectual itch. The woman was right. He was nobody, and he had no business thinking he could improve on the work of Stanford-trained specialists. But as his pencil moved across the paper, as the design took shape, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too easily disappointed. This was more fundamental. This was the certainty that comes from understanding how things work, from seeing a problem and knowing, not believing, but knowing, that there was a solution. He worked until 2 a.m., refining the design, running calculations, checking and rechecking his biomechanical assumptions against the textbooks spread across his bench. When he finally stopped, he had a complete schematic for a knee brace that would cost maybe $400 in materials and could be built in his garage with the tools he already owned. It would never happen, of course. The woman had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with his opinions. He'd probably never see her or her daughter again. This was just an exercise, just proof to himself that all those late nights studying hadn't been completely wasted. Ethan filed the sketches away in a drawer with dozens of other designs that would never be built, turned off the lights, and went to bed. He had no way of knowing that in 3 weeks, the Mercedes would break down again, that the woman would return, this time not with impatience, but with something that looked almost like desperation, that the girl in the wheelchair would look at him with eyes that asked a question he'd spent 3 years preparing to answer. He had no way of knowing that the promise he'd made to Danny in a hospital room was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. All Ethan knew, as sleep finally pulled him under, was that somewhere out there was a girl who was suffering needlessly, trapped in a body that had failed her and equipment that was failing her worse. And for the first time in 3 years, he'd seen that suffering with his own eyes instead of in the abstract pages of medical journals. It changed something. He couldn't articulate what exactly. But as he drifted off, his last conscious thought was a repeat of that old promise, spoken now not to Danny, but to a girl whose name he didn't know. "I won't give up on you, not as long as there's hope." 3 weeks passed before Ethan saw the Mercedes again. 21 days during which he'd almost convinced himself that the encounter had been a strange anomaly, a brief intersection of worlds that would never touch again. He'd filed away the sketches of the knee brace design, buried them under new diagrams and half-finished calculations, and tried to focus on the work that actually paid his bills. Sophie had started asking questions about money, not directly, the way adults did, but in the careful, observant way of children who noticed when their father skipped meals, or when the heat got turned down earlier in the evening to save on the gas bill. She'd asked if they could get a cheaper kind of cereal. She'd stopped mentioning the field trip her class was taking to the Science Museum, the one that cost $35 she knew he didn't have. It was Thursday afternoon, nearly 5 o'clock, when Ethan heard the familiar sputter of an expensive engine failing. He looked up from the Dodge Durango he was working on and felt his stomach drop as the midnight blue Mercedes coasted to a stop in front of his garage for the second time. The woman emerged with the same controlled frustration as before, but this time there was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like resignation. "It died again," she said without preamble. "Different problem this time. It just lost power on the highway." Ethan wiped his hands and walked over to the car. The girl was in the back seat again, wheelchair visible through the tinted windows, but she didn't get out this time. The woman stood with her arms crossed, and Ethan noticed details he'd missed before. The fatigue around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her expensive suit couldn't quite hide the fact that she was barely holding something together. "Let me take a look," he said. This time the diagnosis took longer. The mass airflow sensor he'd replaced was functioning perfectly. Fuel pressure was good. Ignition system checked out. Ethan worked methodically through the possibilities while the woman made phone calls, her voice sharp and professional as she rescheduled meetings and delegated tasks to people whose names Ethan didn't recognize. After 40 minutes, he found it. A failing fuel pump relay, intermittent enough that it hadn't thrown a code, but consistent enough to cause the symptoms she'd described. It was a relatively simple fix, but the part would need to be ordered again. "How long?" the woman asked when he delivered the diagnosis. "I can have the part tomorrow morning. Should be running by noon." She closed her eyes briefly, and Ethan saw her do some kind of internal calculation. "Fine. Can you call me a car service? There's an Uber app if you... I need something that can accommodate a wheelchair." "Right, sorry. There's a medical transport company in Carlsbad. They do non-emergency pickups. Probably take them 30-40 minutes to get here." The woman pulled out her phone and made the call herself, speaking in clipped tones to someone on the other end. When she hung up, she looked around the garage with an expression that suggested she was trying to decide whether to wait inside or take her chances with the heat outside. "You can use the office again if you want," Ethan offered. "Wi-Fi's still the same." She nodded and went to retrieve her laptop from the car. This time, though, the girl came with her. The driver who'd been with them last time wasn't present, and the woman maneuvered the wheelchair herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for years. Ethan tried not to stare as they passed, but he couldn't help noticing the brace again. The same misalignment, the same mechanical constraint that his mind automatically wanted to correct. The girl noticed him looking and quickly glanced away, her face coloring slightly. "Mom, I'm fine out here," she said, her voice quiet. "You don't need to... Lily, please, just sit inside where it's cool." So her name was Lily. Ethan filed that information away as he returned to the Durango, trying to focus on the brake job that actually needed finishing. But his attention kept drifting to the office where mother and daughter sat in uncomfortable proximity, the woman working while Lily stared at her tablet with the glazed expression of someone who'd given up on being interested in anything. 20 minutes passed. 30. Ethan finished the brake job and moved on to paperwork, trying to give them privacy while they waited. Then he heard it, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a soft whimper that Lily tried unsuccessfully to stifle. He looked up to see her shifting in the wheelchair, one hand pressed against her hip, her face pale. The woman, her mother, immediately stopped typing. "Is it bad?" she asked, and there was something raw in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I'm okay," Lily said automatically, but her jaw was clenched tight. "Do you need your medication? I have the pills in my bag." "I already took them an hour ago. They're not helping." The mother's hands hovered uselessly for a moment, and Ethan saw something he hadn't expected. Absolute helplessness on the face of a woman who seemed like she could command anything. She reached out and touched her daughter's shoulder, and Lily leaned into it slightly, and the intimacy of that small gesture made Ethan feel like he was intruding on something private. He should have looked away, should have minded his own business. But he was watching when Lily tried to adjust her position and the brace caught slightly, and he saw the wince that followed, saw the way the mechanical joint forced her leg into an angle that no human knee was meant to sustain. "Excuse me," Ethan said before he could stop himself. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but could I ask what's causing the pain?" The mother's head snapped up, her expression immediately defensive. "That's really not your concern." "I know, you're right, I just..." He trailed off, unsure how to explain without sounding like an arrogant idiot. "I noticed the brace last time, the alignment. And I wondered if maybe that's contributing to... We've been to 17 specialists, the mother cut him off, her voice tight. 17, including doctors at Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and Mayo Clinic. Do you really think you, a mechanic in a garage in Oceanside, can see something they all missed? No, Ethan said honestly. Probably not. But sometimes the obvious things are the easiest to miss because everyone assumes someone else already checked. Mom, Lily said quietly, it's okay. Let him... Absolutely not. Lily, we've been through this. We've tried everything. Every adjustment, every new brace, every experimental treatment. Nothing helps. I'm not going to let some random person who fixes cars convince you there's some miracle solution that actual doctors haven't found. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Ethan felt heat rising in his face, embarrassment mixed with something else. Frustration, maybe, or the particular anger that comes from seeing someone suffer needlessly and being unable to help. You're right, he said quietly. I apologize. It's not my place. He turned back to his work, forcing himself to focus on the invoices that needed processing. Behind him, he heard Lily's mother return to her laptop, the aggressive clicking of keys suggesting she was taking her frustration out on whatever email she was composing. The transport van arrived 45 minutes later. Ethan watched from the garage bay as the driver helped Lily into the vehicle, securing her wheelchair with practiced efficiency. The mother stood nearby, phone pressed to her ear, still working even in the parking lot of a garage in a neighborhood she probably never knew existed before her car started breaking down. Just before getting into the van, Lily looked back at him. Their eyes met for just a second, and Ethan saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not hope, exactly. More like the ghost of hope, the faint memory of what it felt like to believe things could be different. Then the van door closed, and they were gone. Ethan stood in the empty garage, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, and felt something crack open inside him. It was the same feeling he'd had sitting next to Danny's hospital bed, the same helpless rage at a world that broke people and then charged them $47,000 for solutions that didn't solve anything. That night, he pulled out the sketches he'd made 3 weeks ago. The knee brace design with its corrected alignment and natural articulation points. He thought it was just an intellectual exercise, but now it felt like something more, like a possibility that existed in the narrow space between what was and what could be. Sophie was already asleep upstairs. Ethan had 2 hours until he'd collapse from exhaustion. He spent them refining the design, running calculations, checking his assumptions against everything he'd learned from textbooks that cost more than he could afford, and late nights when normal people were sleeping. By midnight, he had something. Not just sketches, but actual plans, measurements, material specifications, a complete design for a knee brace that would cost a fraction of what Lily's current brace had cost and would actually work with her body instead of against it. It would never happen, of course. He'd probably never see them again, and even if he did, why would they trust him? He was nobody, just a mechanic who'd taught himself anatomy from books and pretended he understood things that took doctors decades to master. But the design existed now. It was real on paper, even if it would never be real in metal and carbon fiber and the flesh and blood reality of a girl who'd forgotten what it felt like to move without pain. The Mercedes was ready by noon the next day, just as Ethan had promised. He called the number the woman had left, and she answered on the second ring. "Ms. Cole, your car's ready. I'll send someone to pick it up. Can you have it ready in an hour?" "Sure, just need payment and a signature." "I'll handle that remotely. The driver will have authorization." She hung up before Ethan could respond. An hour later, a driver arrived. Not the same one from before. This was a woman in her 50s who handled the transaction with professional efficiency and no conversation. She paid with a company card, signed the invoice, and drove away, leaving Ethan with the feeling that this chapter had closed as abruptly as it had opened. 2 weeks passed. Spring was giving way to summer, and the garage was busy with people wanting their AC systems serviced before the real heat arrived. Ethan worked 12-hour days, came home to make dinner for Sophie, helped with homework, and fell into bed too exhausted to even think about anatomical sketches or biomechanical calculations. But he thought about Lily, about the pain in her face and the resignation in her eyes, and the way her mother's helplessness had been almost as painful to witness as her daughter's suffering. He thought about the brace that cost more than most people's cars and did nothing but make things worse. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Ethan was under a Subaru, fighting with a stubborn oil filter, when he heard a car pull up. He rolled out from under the vehicle, expecting another routine customer, and froze. The Mercedes. Again. But this time it wasn't engine trouble that brought them. The woman, Ms. Cole, he reminded himself, emerged from the car with an expression that was completely different from the controlled frustration of previous visits. She looked desperate. "Mr. Hale?" she said, and the fact that she knew his name meant she'd been thinking about this, planning this. "Yes, ma'am?" "I need to talk to you about my daughter." Ethan stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "Is she okay?" "No." The word came out flat, exhausted. "She's not okay. She hasn't been okay for 11 years, and I'm running out of options." Lily was in the car. Ethan could see her through the window, her face turned away, looking out at nothing in particular. Ms. Cole walked closer, and in the harsh afternoon light, Ethan could see lines around her eyes that makeup had hidden before. Evidence of nights without sleep and days of fighting battles that couldn't be won with money or power or force of will. "Last week, Lily's pain got so bad she couldn't sleep for 3 days straight," Ms. Cole said quietly. "We went to the emergency room twice. They increased her medication again, but it's not helping. It's never helping. And She stopped, took a breath, regained some of the composure that seemed to be her default state. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the brace, about the alignment. Ms. Cole, I really don't have any credentials to—" "I don't care about credentials." Her voice was sharp now, almost angry. "Do you know how many credentialed doctors have told me there's nothing more they can do? That Lily just needs to accept her limitations? That the pain is psychological, or that she's just sensitive? Or that she should try meditation or therapy or any number of things that have nothing to do with the fact that my daughter can't walk without agony?" She was breathing hard, years of frustration pouring out in this grimy garage because she'd run out of places to put it. "I've spent over $300,000 on treatments," she continued. "I've taken Lily to every specialist on the West Coast. We've tried experimental procedures and alternative medicine and everything in between. And you know what I've learned? Sometimes the people with the most impressive titles are the least willing to admit they might be wrong." Ethan didn't know what to say. This woman, Marianne Cole, he'd learned her first name from the credit card receipt, was offering him something that felt simultaneously like an opportunity and a trap. "What are you asking me to do?" he said finally. "Look at the brace. Tell me if you really think there's a problem, and if there is—" She paused, and Ethan saw her making a decision that clearly terrified her. "Tell me if you think you can fix it. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an engineer. You're someone who noticed something 17 specialists missed. That's enough for me to at least listen." She turned and walked back to the car, opening the rear door. Lily looked up, surprise and something that might have been fear crossing her face as her mother gestured for her to come out. The wheelchair was unfolded, and then Lily was rolling toward the garage, her mother walking beside her with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Up close, Ethan could see more details. Lily was 17, he learned later, but pain had carved away some of the softness that should have still been in her face. She had her mother's dark hair, though hers was longer, pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her eyes were gray, intelligent, and wary, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Lily, this is Mr. Hale," Marianne said. "He's the mechanic I told you about." "Hi," Lily said quietly. "Hi." Ethan suddenly felt completely inadequate to the moment. Your mom asked if I could take a look at your brace. Would that be okay with you?" Lily glanced at her mother, then back at Ethan. "What would you need to do?" "Just examine it, see how it's positioned, how the joints are aligned. I wouldn't need to remove it or anything. Just look." There was a long pause. Ethan could see Lily weighing the risk of hope against the certainty of disappointment. It was a calculation she'd probably made 1,000 times before. "Okay," she said finally. Ethan knelt down beside the wheelchair, and for the first time he could see the brace up close. It was even more sophisticated than he'd realized. Titanium frame with carbon fiber reinforcement, articulated joints with microhydraulics, custom padding molded to Lily's specific anatomy. The engineering was impressive. The execution was flawed. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. "How you ended up needing the brace?" Lily looked at her mother, who nodded slightly. "I was 6, Lily said, her voice soft. "There was an accident, car crash. My femur was shattered in 3 places, and there was severe damage to the knee. They did surgery, put it back together with pins and plates, but it never healed right. By the time I was 8, I couldn't walk without falling. That's when they fitted me for the first brace." "And you've had pain since then?" "Not at first. The first couple years were okay. But as I grew, things got worse. They'd adjust the brace, make new ones, try different configurations. Nothing helped. Some things made it worse." Ethan examined the knee joint mechanism, his fingers tracing the alignment without touching Lily's leg. He could see it now, clear as day. The axis of rotation was offset from where the natural knee would pivot. It was probably 5 millimeters, maybe 6. Such a small distance. But that tiny offset meant that every time Lily tried to move, the brace was forcing her knee to rotate around an unnatural center point, creating torque that translated into stress on her hip and ankle. "How long have you had this particular brace?" he asked. 2 years. It was supposed to be the final solution. Dr. Chen said it was the most advanced orthotic device available. "It is," Ethan said honestly. "The technology is incredible, but I think the knee joint might be positioned incorrectly." He heard Marianne take in a sharp breath. Lily just looked at him with those tired gray eyes. "How incorrectly?" she asked. "Maybe 5 millimeters too far back. It sounds small, but it means the brace is trying to make your leg bend around a point that doesn't match where your actual knee wants to bend. That creates stress. Over time, with every movement, that stress accumulates." "Can you show me?" Marianne asked, her voice tight. Ethan stood and walked to his workbench, grabbing a piece of paper and a pencil. He drew quickly. A simplified diagram of a leg, showing the natural pivot point of the knee, and then showing where the brace's joint was actually positioned. "Here," he said, pointing. "This is where the rotation should happen, and this is where the brace is making it happen. Every time Lily tries to bend her knee, her body is fighting against this offset. It's like," he searched for an analogy they'd understand. "It's like if you hung a door, but you put the hinges an inch to the left of where they should be. The door might still swing, but it would bind and scrape and eventually damage the frame because the mechanics are wrong." Marianne studied the diagram with the intensity of someone used to analyzing complex information. "If this is true, why wouldn't Dr. Chen have caught it?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Maybe because the offset is so small. Maybe because the brace was designed based on measurements that were taken with Lily in a static position, not accounting for dynamic movement. Maybe because sometimes when you're working with really advanced technology, you trust the precision of the manufacturing and assume the design must be right." "Can you fix it?" Lily asked, and there was something in her voice that broke Ethan's heart, the barest hint of hope trying to surface through years of learned helplessness. I think so. Maybe. I'd need to adjust the position of the knee joint, move it forward to align with your natural axis of rotation. But I want to be clear, I've never done this before. I've studied the biomechanics, I understand the principles, but I've never actually modified an orthotic device. I could make it worse. I could damage the brace beyond repair, and I have no way of knowing if this will help your pain." "But you think it might," Marianne said. "Yes, I think it might." Mother and daughter looked at each other, communicating in the wordless way of people who'd been through hell together. Ethan saw Marianne's doubt warring with her desperation, saw Lily's fear battling against the faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally seen what everyone else had missed. "What would you need?" Marianne asked finally. "Time to plan the modification, materials to make the adjustment, and permission to work on medical equipment that I'm not qualified to work on." "If I give you that permission, am I liable if something goes wrong?" "I honestly don't know the legal implications." "Probably. But I can write up a waiver if—" "I don't care about the waiver." Marianne's voice was suddenly fierce. I care about my daughter. Can you help her or not? It was the question Ethan had been avoiding answering directly because he knew what was at stake. This wasn't an intellectual exercise anymore. This was real. This was a 17-year-old girl who'd been in pain for 11 years, sitting in front of him with eyes that had forgotten what hope looked like. If he said yes and failed, he wouldn't just be wrong. He'd be cruel. He'd be one more in a long line of people who'd promised relief and delivered nothing but disappointment. But if he said no, if he walked away from this because he was afraid of failing, then what was the point of all those late nights studying? What was the point of the promise he'd made to Danny? I think I can help, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. I can't promise anything, but I'll give you everything I have. Marianne nodded slowly. When can you start? I need a few days to plan the modification, and I'll need to work on the brace while Lily's wearing it. I need to see how it moves, how it interacts with her actual anatomy. Is that okay? He directed the question to Lily, not her mother. It was her body, her pain, her choice. Yes, Lily said quietly. When should I come back? Give me 3 days to prepare. Then we'll try. They left shortly after, Marianne writing down Ethan's phone number and promising to return on Friday afternoon. Ethan watched the Mercedes pull away, and only when it was out of sight did he allow himself to fully process what he'd just agreed to do. He'd volunteered to modify a $47,000 medical device. He had no training, no certification, nothing but sketches in a notebook and knowledge gleaned from textbooks. If this went wrong, he could be sued. He could lose everything. And far worse than any legal or financial consequences, he could hurt someone who'd already been hurt too much. That night, Ethan worked until 3 a.m. He reviewed everything he knew about knee biomechanics, double-checked his calculations, sketched out modification plans and backup approaches. Sophie found him at his workbench in the morning, asleep with his head on an anatomy textbook, pencil still in hand. "Dad?" she said, gently shaking his shoulder. "You're going to be late opening the garage." Ethan jerked awake, his neck screaming in protest from the awkward angle. He looked at his daughter's concerned face and felt a wave of guilt. He'd been so focused on the possibility of helping Lily that he'd neglected the person he was responsible for. "Sorry, sweetheart. I got caught up in something." "The drawings?" Sophie looked at the sketches spread across the workbench. "Are you going to help someone?" "I'm going to try." The girl in the wheelchair from the car that broke down?" She was too observant, his daughter. Too smart for her own good sometimes. "Yeah, her name's Lily." "Is she nice?" "I think so. I don't really know her yet." Sophie studied the sketches with the same intensity she brought to her science homework. "This looks really complicated." "It is. But you can do it, right? You're really smart, Dad." The absolute faith in her voice nearly broke him. Sophie believed in him the way children believed in their parents, without reservation or doubt. She had no idea that her father was terrified, that he was about to attempt something he had no business attempting, that failure was not just possible but probable. "I hope so, baby. I really hope so." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation and second-guessing. Ethan worked on regular car repairs during the day, but his mind was always half-focused on the modification plan. At night, he refined his approach, ordered specialized tools he couldn't really afford, and reviewed his biomechanical calculations until his eyes burned from exhaustion. He also did something he'd never done before. He reached out for help. There was a professor at San Diego State, Dr. Patricia Mendez, who taught biomechanical engineering and had published several papers on orthotic design. Ethan had read her work obsessively during his late-night study sessions. He'd never contacted her before because what would he say? "Hi, I'm a mechanic who reads your papers and pretends to understand them." But now he had a real case, a real problem. So he crafted an email, trying to sound professional and not like a complete fraud, explaining the situation and asking if she'd be willing to review his modification plan. He sent it at midnight on Wednesday and didn't expect a response. But Thursday morning, there was a reply in his inbox. "Mr. Help. Your observations about the knee joint alignment are intriguing. I'd be happy to review your plans. However, I must caution you that modifying medical devices without proper oversight carries significant risks, both legal and medical. If you're serious about this, I'd recommend consulting with the girl's physician first. That said, I'm attaching some resources that might be helpful. Good luck. PM. She'd attached 3 PDFs, technical papers on knee joint biomechanics that Ethan devoured like a starving man at a feast. The information confirmed his approach, but also revealed complications he hadn't considered. By Friday morning, he'd revised his modification plan twice, incorporating insights from Dr. Mendez's research. Friday afternoon arrived with the inevitability of a ticking clock. At 2:00 p.m., the Mercedes pulled into the garage. Marianne emerged first, followed by a different driver helping Lily out. Today, Lily was wearing jeans and a loose t-shirt, and Ethan noticed she looked even more nervous than she had 3 days ago. "We're here," Marianne said unnecessarily. "Are you ready?" No, Ethan thought, not even close. "Yes," he said. "Come on in." He'd cleaned the garage, actually cleaned it, sweeping the floors and organizing his tools, trying to make the space feel less like a place where cars came to die, and more like somewhere healing might happen. He'd set up a folding chair near his workbench, positioned under good lighting where he could see what he was doing. Lily wheeled herself over to the chair, and with effort that she tried to hide, transferred from the wheelchair to the seat. Ethan could see the pain the movement caused, the careful way she had to position herself to minimize the stress on her hip and knee. "Okay," he said, pulling on a pair of clean gloves. "I'm going to examine the brace first, see exactly how it's attached and where the adjustment points are. This might take a while. Let me know if you need a break or if anything hurts." Lily nodded, her jaw set in determination. Ethan knelt beside her and began his examination, his hands careful and professional as he traced the brace's structure. The device was even more complex up close. Multiple adjustment points, tension settings, articulation controls. He took measurements, compared them to the sketches he'd made, and felt his stomach sink as he realized the modification was going to be harder than he'd thought. The knee joint wasn't just offset, it was integrated into a support system that distributed forces across the entire leg. Adjusting it would require recalibrating the tension in multiple locations, or else he'd just create a different set of problems. Marianne watched from nearby, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Ethan was acutely aware that she was probably questioning her decision to trust a mechanic with her daughter's well-being. "Okay," he said after 20 minutes of examination. "I can do this, but it's going to take several hours, and I'm going to need to make adjustments incrementally, move the joint a millimeter at a time, test how it feels, make sure I'm not creating new problems." "How long?" Marianne asked. "Best case? 3 hours. Worst case? I might need to stop and rethink the approach. It's more complicated than I anticipated." He saw doubt flicker across Marianne's face. This was the moment where she could pull back, where common sense would tell her to take her daughter to an actual medical facility instead of letting a stranger experiment on her in a garage. "Do it," Lily said quietly. Both Ethan and Marianne looked at her in surprise. "I've been in pain for 11 years, Lily continued, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Every specialist says there's nothing more they can do. Every treatment makes it worse or does nothing. If there's even a chance this could help, I want to try." Marianne reached out and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "Okay," she said. "We try." Ethan took a deep breath and began to work. The modification was painstaking. Every adjustment had to be precise, every movement calibrated. Ethan worked with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb, knowing that one mistake could make everything worse. He loosened the mounting points of the knee joint, shifted it forward by increments so small they were almost invisible, then tested the range of motion. "How does that feel?" he asked after the first adjustment. "Different," Lily said. "Not better or worse, just different." He continued, making tiny alterations, asking for feedback after each one. An hour passed, then 2. Ethan's back ached from kneeling, and sweat dripped down his face despite the industrial fans running. But he didn't stop. At the 2.5-hour mark, something changed. Ethan made an adjustment, tested the joint's movement, and heard Lily gasp. "What?" Marianne asked immediately, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Lily said, and her voice was strange. When I move my leg, it doesn't catch. There's no binding." Ethan's hands were shaking as he made one more minute adjustment. "Try bending your knee, slowly." Lily did. The brace moved smoothly, the joint tracking along a path that finally matched what her body wanted to do naturally. There was no resistance, no unnatural torque. "Oh my God," Lily whispered. "I can feel the difference." But Ethan knew better than to celebrate yet. No binding was good, but it didn't mean the pain would go away. He spent another 30 minutes fine-tuning the tension settings, making sure the load was distributed correctly across the entire leg. Finally, he sat back on his heels, exhausted. "Okay, that's as good as I can get it without you trying to stand." The garage fell silent. This was the moment of truth. Lily looked at her mother, who looked at Ethan, and he saw all of their fear and hope and desperation reflected in that exchange of glances. "Do you want to try?" Marianne asked her daughter. Lily's hands gripped the arms of the chair. "Yes." Ethan and Marianne helped her stand, supporting her weight as she rose. Lily put weight on her right leg, the one with the brace, and Ethan watched her face carefully for signs of pain. "How is it?" he asked. I don't know, different. The pressure's in different places." She shifted her weight slightly, testing. I think it might be better." She took a step, then stopped, her face going pale. Ethan's heart sank. He'd failed. He'd moved things around and made it worse, and "It doesn't hurt," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "When I step, it doesn't hurt the way it usually does." "Are you sure?" Marianne asked, and Ethan heard years of false hope in that question, the learned skepticism of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. Lily took another step. Her gait was awkward, uncertain, but she wasn't crying out in pain, wasn't wincing with every movement. "I'm sure," she said. "Something's different. It's not perfect, but Mom, it's so much better." Marianne covered her mouth with one hand, and Ethan saw tears gathering in her eyes. But she didn't let them fall, not yet, because experience had taught her that better wasn't the same as healed. "Let's not overdo it," Ethan said quickly. "You need to build up gradually. The brace is adjusted, but your muscles and joints need time to adapt to the new movement pattern." They helped Lily back into the wheelchair, and Ethan could see she was exhausted from the combination of physical stress and emotional intensity. But there was something different in her expression, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Possibility, maybe. Marianne pulled him aside while Lily rested. "What do we owe you?" she asked quietly. Ethan hadn't even thought about money. "Nothing. I didn't do anything yet. We need to see if this actually helps over the next few days." "Mr. Hale." "Ethan, please." "Ethan, you just spent 3.5 hours working on my daughter's brace. I need to pay you. Let's wait and see if it works first." Marianne studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You really believe you can help her?" It wasn't a question. "I believe I'm going to try everything I know how to do," Ethan said. "Whether that's enough, we'll find out." They left as the sun was setting, Marianne promising to call the next day with an update. Ethan watched them drive away, then slumped against his workbench, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. He'd done it. He'd actually modified the brace. And unless Lily had been lying, it seemed to have helped, at least a little. But Ethan knew this was just the beginning. One good moment didn't mean success. He'd seen enough failed treatments, enough false starts with Danny, to know that initial improvements could disappear as quickly as they appeared. The real test would come in the days ahead. Would the adjustment hold? Would Lily's pain continue to decrease, or would it come roaring back? And if it did help, what then? He couldn't just send her back into the world with a modified brace and hope for the best. There would be questions, challenges, probably legal issues he hadn't even considered. But for now, in the fading light of a Friday evening, Ethan allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. He'd kept his promise to try. He'd given everything he had. The rest was up to fate, physics, and a 17-year-old girl who'd been brave enough to let a stranger try what everyone else said was impossible. The call came at 6:47 the next morning, yanking Ethan from the first deep sleep he'd had in days. He fumbled for his phone, squinting at the unknown number, his heart already racing with the certainty that something had gone wrong. "Hello?" "Ethan, it's Marianne Cole." Her voice was tight, controlled, but there was something underneath it he couldn't identify. We need to talk. His stomach dropped. Is Lily okay? Did the adjustment cause problems? There was a pause, and in that silence, Ethan prepared himself for the worst. He'd made it worse. The modification had failed. Maybe Lily had fallen. Maybe the brace had broken. Maybe... She slept through the night, Marianne said, and now Ethan could hear what was in her voice. It was disbelief. For the first time in 3 years, my daughter slept for 8 hours straight without waking up from pain. Ethan sat up in bed, fully awake now. That's good. That's really good. She woke up an hour ago and asked if she could try walking again. Not just a few steps. She wants to really walk. And Marianne's composure cracked slightly. I don't know if I should let her. What if yesterday was a fluke? What if she pushes too hard and damages something? Has she been taking her pain medication? She didn't take any last night. She said she didn't need it. Ethan threw off his blanket, already moving toward his dresser for clean clothes. Bring her in. Let me check the brace, make sure everything's holding. Then we can assess whether it's safe for her to do more. When? I can be at the garage in 20 minutes. We'll be there in 30. Ethan hung up and stood in his small bedroom, his hands trembling slightly. One night of reduced pain didn't prove anything. The placebo effect was real and powerful. Maybe Lily had simply convinced herself she felt better because she wanted so desperately to believe. Maybe the adrenaline and excitement of the modification had temporarily overridden pain signals. There were a dozen explanations that didn't require his adjustment to have actually worked. But she'd slept through the night, 3 years without sleeping through the night, and one day after his modification, she'd slept for 8 hours. Dad? Sophie's voice came from her bedroom doorway. Who was that? The girl I told you about, Lily. I need to go check on her. Sophie nodded, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Is she better? Maybe. I don't know yet. Can you get yourself breakfast? I left money on the counter for... I know, Dad. I'll be fine. Go help her. Ethan kissed the top of his daughter's head and headed for the garage, his mind already running through every possible complication. The knee joint alignment could have shifted overnight. The tension settings might have loosened. The modification could have placed stress on parts of the brace that weren't designed to handle it, causing structural fatigue that would manifest as failure after repeated use. He was sitting at his workbench reviewing his notes when the Mercedes pulled up 28 minutes later. Marianne emerged first, but this time she didn't look like an executive dealing with an inconvenient problem. She looked like a mother who'd been offered something she was terrified to believe in. The driver helped Lily out, but Ethan noticed immediately that something was different. Lily wasn't slumped in the wheelchair with the defeated posture he'd seen before. She was sitting upright, alert, and when she caught his eye through the garage door, she smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. Good morning, Ethan said as they came inside. How are you feeling? Better? Lily said simply. Really better. Not just a little bit, actually, genuinely better. Tell me specifically what's different. Lily glanced at her mother, then back at Ethan. The constant burning sensation in my hip, it's gone. The sharp pain that used to shoot down my leg when I moved a certain way, gone. There's still some discomfort, especially when I first stand up, but it's like someone turned down the volume on everything. Ethan knelt beside the wheelchair and began examining the brace with the careful attention of a watchmaker studying a timepiece. The adjustment was holding. The knee joint was still positioned where he'd moved it, the tension settings unchanged. There were no visible signs of stress or failure in the structure. Can I try walking? Lily asked. Please, I know you said to take it slow, but I feel like I can do more than yesterday. Every instinct told Ethan to say no, to be cautious, to prevent her from pushing too hard and risking injury. But when he looked at her face, he saw something that stopped the words in his throat. She looked alive in a way she hadn't before, like someone who'd been held underwater and had just broken the surface. Okay, he said slowly. But we do this carefully, small steps, and you tell me immediately if anything hurts. Not discomfort, pain. Understand? I understand. Ethan and Marianne helped Lily stand. She wavered slightly, finding her balance, then took a breath and stepped forward with her right leg. The movement was smoother than yesterday, more confident. She brought her left leg forward, then her right again. She was walking, Not perfectly. There was still a hitch in her gait, still careful deliberation in each movement, but she was walking without the sharp intakes of breath, without the white-knuckled grip on whatever support was nearby, without the look of someone enduring torture with each step. "How far do you want to go?" Ethan asked, walking beside her. "To the end of the garage and back." It was maybe 30 feet. Lily covered the distance slowly, her concentration absolute. At the far wall, she turned carefully and started back. Halfway there, her right leg trembled slightly, and Ethan reached out to steady her. "You okay?" "Just tired. The muscles aren't used to this." She made it back to the wheelchair and sat down heavily, breathing hard but grinning. "Did you see that? I just walked 60 feet. "I saw," Marianne said, and there were tears streaming down her face now, the composure completely shattered. "Baby, you were amazing." Lily reached up and took her mother's hand, and Ethan turned away to give them a moment of privacy, his own eyes burning. This was what he'd imagined during all those late nights studying. This exact moment. Someone moving who couldn't move before, someone freed from pain that had become their entire world. He'd done that. Not cured her. He wasn't naive enough to think this was a cure, but he'd given her something she hadn't had in 11 years. He'd given her possibility. "What happens now?" Marianne asked when she'd regained some control. "Does she need more adjustments? Should we see her doctors? I don't even know what the next step is." Ethan had been thinking about this question since yesterday. The adjustment is holding, which is good, but Lily's muscles and joints have adapted to moving incorrectly for over a decade. She's going to need physical therapy, real therapy with someone who understands biomechanics, to retrain her body to move naturally. "Will you do it?" Lily asked. "I'm not a physical therapist." "You're the person who figured out what 17 specialists missed," Marianne said. "I trust you more than I trust anyone else right now." The weight of that trust settled on Ethan's shoulders like a physical thing. These people were putting their faith in him based on one successful modification, one night of reduced pain, 60 feet of walking. They didn't know about all the times he'd failed with Danny, all the designs that never worked, all the late nights that produced nothing but frustration and wasted materials. "I'll help however I can," he said carefully. "But I think we should also consult with actual medical professionals. I've been in contact with a biomechanical engineering professor at San Diego State, Dr. Patricia Mendez. She might be willing to oversee the rehabilitation process, provide guidance." "Will she even take us seriously?" Marianne asked. "When she finds out the modification was done in a garage by someone without credentials?" "There's only one way to find out." That afternoon, Ethan composed an email to Dr. Mendez, laying out what had happened with as much professional language as he could muster. He attached photos of the brace modification, the before and after measurements, and his notes on Lily's response. He hit send before he could second-guess himself and tried to return to the brake job he was supposed to be finishing. The response came 4 hours later. "Mr. Hale, what you've described is remarkable. I'd like to meet with you and the patient to assess the situation properly. However, I must be direct. What you've done exists in a legal gray area that could have serious consequences if anything goes wrong. I strongly recommend we bring in medical oversight immediately. I have contacts at Scripps Hospital who might be willing to consult. Are you available Monday morning? PM." Ethan read the email 3 times, his emotions swinging between elation that a real professor was taking him seriously and terror at the mention of legal consequences and hospital involvement. This was spiraling beyond his control, beyond the simple question of whether he could help someone in pain. He called Marianne and read her the email. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think she's right about the legal issues, and about needing proper medical oversight. This stopped being simple the moment Lily started improving. Will the doctors try to take over? Will they dismiss what you've done?" "I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I'm just a mechanic who got lucky." "You're the person who gave my daughter her life back." Marianne's voice was fierce. "Don't diminish that. Whatever happens next, we do it together. Understood?" "Understood." The meeting was scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m. at Dr. Mendez's office on the San Diego State campus. Ethan closed the garage for the morning, ignoring the 3 customers he had to reschedule, and made the 40-minute drive north with a stomach full of anxiety. Dr. Patricia Mendez was in her early 50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her office was cramped but organized, every surface covered with papers, biomechanical models, and framed degrees that reminded Ethan of exactly how unqualified he was to be sitting across from her. Marianne and Lily arrived 10 minutes later, and Dr. Mendez's expression softened when she saw the wheelchair. "You must be Lily," she said, her voice warm. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be overwhelming." "It's okay," Lily said quietly. Dr. Mendez turned to Ethan. "Let's start with you showing me exactly what you did." For the next hour, Ethan walked through his analysis, his modification process, and the results he'd observed. Dr. Mendez listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, her expression professionally neutral. She examined the brace, took measurements, and asked Lily to demonstrate her range of motion. When Ethan finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Well?" Marianne finally asked, unable to stand the silence. "It's elegant," Dr. Mendez said, looking at Ethan with something that might have been respect. "The modification is simple, but it addresses the exact mechanical flaw that was causing the problem. The alignment is now within 2 millimeters of optimal. Honestly, better than many professionally designed braces I've reviewed." "So he did it right?" Lily asked. "He did it right, which creates both an opportunity and a problem." Dr. Mendez turned to Marianne. "The opportunity is that your daughter might be able to achieve significant functional improvement if we build on this foundation with proper rehabilitation. The problem is that this modification was done outside of any medical system, without oversight, and technically using equipment that wasn't Mr. Hale's to modify." "Are you saying he could be in legal trouble?" Marianne's voice had gone cold. "I'm saying there are complex questions here that go beyond biomechanics. The brace was prescribed by a physician. It was built to specific specifications by a licensed manufacturer. Mr. Hale altered it without authorization. If something had gone wrong, if Lily had been injured, the liability issues would be severe." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He'd been so focused on trying to help that he hadn't fully considered the legal minefield he was walking through. "But nothing went wrong," Lily said. "I'm better." "You are," Dr. Mendez agreed, "and that's wonderful. But from a medical and legal standpoint, we need to regularize this situation. I'd like to bring in Dr. James Morrison from Scripps Hospital. He's an orthopedic specialist, I trust, someone who's willing to think outside traditional approaches. If he's willing to provide medical oversight, we might be able to continue Lily's rehabilitation under proper supervision." "And if he's not willing?" Ethan asked. Dr. Mendez met his eyes. "Then we have a problem, because while what you've achieved is remarkable, it cannot continue in a garage without medical backup. The risks are too high." The meeting with Dr. Morrison happened 2 days later, and Ethan knew within the first 5 minutes that it was going to be a disaster. Morrison was in his 60s, clearly accomplished, and equally clearly unimpressed with the entire situation. He examined Lily's brace with the expression of someone examining a car that had been repaired by a shade tree mechanic. "This modification is crude," he said bluntly. "The adjustment mechanism was done with basic tools, the calibration is eyeballed rather than measured precisely, and there's no documentation of the changes that would allow another professional to replicate or adjust the work." "It helped my daughter walk," Marianne said, her voice tight with anger. "I don't doubt that she feels better, but feeling better isn't the same as being healed. For all we know, this modification is creating stresses that will cause problems down the line. Stress fractures, joint degeneration, muscle imbalances. Without proper imaging and long-term monitoring, there's no way to know." "So what are you suggesting?" Dr. Mendez asked. "I'm suggesting we remove this modified brace and fit Lily with a new one, designed properly from the ground up with the alignment corrections Mr. Hale identified. We do this right, through proper channels, with appropriate oversight and documentation." "How long would that take?" Lily asked, her voice small. 6 to 8 weeks for design and manufacturing, then fitting and adjustment, probably another few weeks." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you use your current unmodified brace." Lily's face went white. "The old one? The one that caused all the pain?" "It's that or continue using equipment that's been modified in a non-sterile environment by someone without medical training. I can't in good conscience recommend the latter. Ethan watched Lily's expression crumble, watched hope drain from her face like water from a broken vessel. She'd had 3 days of reduced pain, 3 days of walking more than a few feet, 3 days of believing things could be different. And now a doctor was telling her she had to give it up and go back to suffering while they spent months building something through proper channels. No, Lily said. Everyone turned to look at her. No, she repeated, stronger this time. I'm not going back to the old brace. I can't. You don't understand what it was like, the constant pain, never sleeping, never being able to do anything without hurting. Ethan's modification isn't perfect, but it's better than anything any doctor has done for me in 11 years. I'm keeping it. Lily, honey, Marianne started. Mom, no. I know you want to do the right thing, the safe thing. But sometimes the right thing for other people isn't the right thing for me. Ethan helped me. I trust him. And I'm not going back. Dr. Morrison's expression hardened. Young lady, you're a minor. This isn't your decision to make. Actually, Marianne said quietly, it is. Lily will be 18 in 4 months, and even if she weren't, I'm her mother, and I'm the one who makes medical decisions for her. And I agree with my daughter. We're keeping the modified brace. Then I can't provide medical oversight, Morrison said flatly. I won't put my license at risk by endorsing work that doesn't meet professional standards. Then we'll find someone who will, Marianne said. The meeting ended badly, with Morrison warning about liability and malpractice and professional responsibility. Dr. Mendez looked torn, caught between her professional obligations and what she'd seen with her own eyes. In the parking lot afterward, Marianne turned to Ethan. I'm sorry, I thought bringing in doctors would help, but instead, you were right to try, Ethan said. Morrison has valid concerns. I'm working outside my competence, modifying medical equipment I have no business touching. From his perspective, he's protecting Lily. From his perspective, I'm just a problem that doesn't fit in his boxes, Lily said bitterly. He doesn't care that I'm better. He cares about covering his ass. Lily, Marianne said automatically, but without much force. It's true, Mom. All those doctors, all those specialists, they all had their protocols and their proper procedures, and none of it helped. Ethan helped. In 3 hours in a garage, he did more than they did in 11 years. Ethan felt the weight of that statement like a stone. I got lucky, Lily. I saw one thing that happened to be fixable. That doesn't make me a miracle worker. What do we do now? Marianne asked. It was Dr. Mendez who answered. She'd followed them out to the parking lot, and now she stood with her arms crossed, clearly wrestling with a decision. I'll do it, she said finally. I'll provide oversight. Not as a medical doctor, I can't do that. But as a biomechanical consultant, I can monitor the brace's performance, track Lily's progress, and if problems develop, I can flag them early. Won't that put you at risk? Ethan asked. Probably, but I didn't become an engineer to protect myself. I became an engineer to solve problems, and this is a problem worth solving. She looked at Lily. You'll need to come in twice a week so I can take measurements, assess your gait, check for any signs of structural issues. Can you do that? Yes, Lily said immediately. Thank you so much. Dr. Mendez nodded, then turned to Ethan. You need to document everything, every adjustment you make, every observation, every measurement. If we're going to do this outside the traditional system, we need to be twice as careful as people working inside it. Understand? I understand. And if I tell you to stop, if I see anything that concerns me medically, you stop. No arguments. Agreed. That night, Ethan sat at his workbench and created a proper logbook. He documented the original modification, recorded Lily's responses over the past few days, and set up a system for tracking every future change. It felt inadequate compared to what a real medical team would do, but it was better than nothing. Sophie found him working at midnight and climbed onto the stool beside him. You're helping the girl, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm trying. Is it working? So far, but it's complicated. Sophie leaned against his shoulder, and Ethan wrapped an arm around her, grateful for the simple warmth of his daughter's presence. Dad, what you're doing, it's really important, isn't it? It matters to Lily. It matters to you too, I can tell. She was right, of course. Ethan had told himself he was doing this for Lily, to keep a promise made to Danny, to prove that all those late nights studying weren't wasted. But somewhere along the way, it had become about more than that. It had become about whether he could be more than what life had reduced him to. Whether a mechanic in a garage could do something that mattered. Yeah, he admitted. It matters to me too. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm. Lily came to the garage 3 times a week for adjustments and practice. Ethan would check the brace, make minute modifications based on her feedback, and then guide her through increasingly ambitious walking exercises. Dr. Mendez came once a week to take measurements and assess progress, filling notebooks with data that gave their unconventional rehabilitation a veneer of scientific legitimacy. Lily's improvement was steady, but not linear. Some days she could walk 100 feet with minimal discomfort. Other days, old pain patterns would reassert themselves, and she'd struggle to make it 20 feet. Ethan learned to recognize which pains were normal muscle fatigue from unused muscles finally working and which were warning signs that something in the brace needed adjustment. It was exhausting, meticulous work. And Ethan's regular business was suffering. He was turning away customers because he didn't have time, staying up until 2 a.m. to finish break jobs he should have completed during the day, burning through his savings to pay bills while his revenue dropped. Sophie noticed, even though he tried to hide it. She started making her own lunches for school, stopped asking for new clothes, became so quiet and self-sufficient that it broke his heart. "We're okay, right, Dad?" she asked one night. "We're fine, sweetheart. You're not eating much." "I'm just busy." She looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "Is helping Lily going to make us not fine?" Ethan pulled her into a hug. "No, I promise. We'll figure it out." But he didn't know if that was true. His savings account was approaching 0. He had maybe 2 months before he'd have to choose between paying rent on the garage or buying groceries. The smart thing would be to scale back, to tell Lily he could only see her once a week, to focus on work that actually paid. But every time he considered it, he'd remember the look on her face when she took those first pain-free steps. He'd remember Danny wasting away in a hospital bed while Ethan frantically searched for answers that came too late. He couldn't quit. Not yet. Not while there was still hope. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week. Lily had been practicing her walking, gradually building up distance and confidence. That day she'd made it from one end of the garage to the other and back 3 times without stopping. Ethan was making notes in his logbook when he heard Marianne's sharp intake of breath. He looked up to see Lily standing in the middle of the garage, no longer holding on to anything for support. She lifted her right foot, the one with the brace, and took a step. Not the careful, deliberate step she'd been doing for weeks. A normal step. The kind of step someone takes when they're not thinking about it, when movement is just something their body knows how to do. Then another, and another. She was walking across the garage with a fluidity that Ethan hadn't seen before, the brace moving in perfect synchronization with her natural gait. "Lily," Marianne said, her voice cracking. "Baby, look at you." Lily glanced down at her own feet, as if surprised to find them moving so naturally. She laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy, and took 5 more steps before stopping, breathing hard but grinning. "Did you see that?" she asked, looking at Ethan. "I wasn't even thinking about it. I was just walking." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. This was it. This was the moment he'd been working toward, the proof that the modification wasn't just reducing pain, but actually restoring function. "How do you feel?" he managed to ask. "Tired, my muscles are burning, but Ethan," she paused, searching for words. "I don't hurt. I'm moving and I don't hurt." Marianne was crying openly now, and Lily wheeled over to her mother and stood up from the chair, stood up without help, without grimacing, and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. "We did it, Mom," she whispered. "We actually did it." They held each other in the middle of the garage, and Ethan turned away to give them privacy, his own eyes burning. He'd done this. With nothing but knowledge gleaned from textbooks and a promise to a dead man, he'd given a girl her life back. The elation lasted exactly 4 days. On Saturday morning, Ethan received a certified letter. It was from the legal department of Stanford Medical Center on behalf of Dr. Raymond Chen, the orthopedic specialist who had designed Lily's original brace. The letter informed him that he was in violation of multiple medical device regulations, that he had modified proprietary equipment without authorization, and that he was to cease all work with the patient immediately pending a formal investigation. There was also a mention of potential criminal charges. Ethan read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Someone had reported him. Maybe Morrison, maybe someone at the hospital, maybe just a bureaucrat who'd heard about what he was doing and decided it violated protocol. He called Marianne immediately. "I got it too," she said, her voice tight. "Along with a letter saying Lily's health insurance is refusing to cover any treatment related to the modified brace. They're calling it an unapproved medical device." "What does that mean?" "It means if something goes wrong, we're completely on our own. No coverage, no support, nothing." Ethan sank into his desk chair. "I'm sorry. I should have thought about insurance implications. I should have—" "Stop. This isn't your fault. Someone decided to make trouble, and now we deal with it." "How?" There was a long pause. "I don't know, but I know we can't stop now. Lily's walking, Ethan, really walking. For the first time in 11 years, my daughter has hope. I'm not taking that away from her because some administrator is worried about liability." That should have been the end of the conversation, but Ethan had something else he needed to say, something that had been growing in his mind over the past few days. "Marianne, I'm running out of money." The admission hung in the air between them. "The work with Lily, it's taking up all my time. I'm not keeping up with regular customers. My bills are piling up. I've got maybe 6 weeks before I can't make rent on the garage." "How much do you need?" Marianne asked immediately. I'm not asking for money. I'm telling you that I might not be able to keep doing this much longer. Even if we ignore the legal threats, the practical reality is that I can't afford to work for free indefinitely." "Then let me pay you." "I should have insisted from the beginning." "It's not about payment, it's about time. Every hour I spend with Lily is an hour I'm not spending on work that keeps the lights on for my daughter." Marianne was quiet for a moment. "What if we brought you on as a consultant? Officially. I could pay you what I'd pay a physical therapist, give you a contract that provides at least some legal cover. Would that help?" "I'm not a physical therapist. You're the person who gave my daughter her life back. That's worth more to me than any credential." Her voice softened. "Ethan, please. Don't quit now. Not when we're so close." "Close to what?" he wanted to ask. "Close to Lily walking independently? Close to proving his modification worked? Close to getting arrested for practicing medicine without a license?" But he knew what she meant. They were close to something that mattered, something that transcended legal technicalities and insurance policies and professional credentials. They were close to proving that sometimes the right answer came from unlikely places, that innovation didn't only happen in universities and research hospitals. "Okay," he said, "we keep going, but we do it smart. I'll document everything, work with Dr. Mendez to make sure we're not missing anything medically, and we'll be ready if the legal threats become real legal action." "Thank you," Marianne said quietly. "I know what you're risking." After hanging up, Ethan sat alone in his office and tried to process what he'd just committed to. He was deliberately continuing work that medical authorities had told him to stop, work that could result in criminal charges, work that was destroying his financial stability. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Lily walking across the garage with that look of wonder on her face. He saw the possibility that his years of study hadn't been wasted, that Danny's death hadn't been entirely meaningless, that maybe, just maybe, he could be someone who made a difference. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was giving up, and Ethan had made a promise. Never give up on people who still have hope. And Lily Cole, for the first time in 11 years, had hope walking forward on legs that finally remembered how. The second letter arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by a process server who handed Ethan the envelope with the practiced indifference of someone who'd ruined 1,000 people's days. This one wasn't from Stanford Medical Center. It was from the California Medical Board, and the language was even more severe than the first. Words like unauthorized medical practice and patient endangerment and cease and desist jumped off the page like accusations. Ethan sat in his office with the letter trembling in his hands, trying to understand how helping someone had transformed into a potential criminal matter. He'd modified a brace. That was all. He hadn't prescribed medication, hadn't performed surgery, hadn't done anything that required a medical license. But apparently, the law saw things differently. His phone rang. It was Marianne. "Did you get one too?" she asked without preamble. "Just now. Mine came yesterday." They're also threatening to revoke Lily's prescription for the original brace, which would mean insurance won't cover any orthotic device at all. They're trying to force us to stop by, making it financially impossible to continue. Ethan heard the anger in her voice, but underneath it was something else. Fear. Marianne Cole was a woman used to solving problems with money and influence, but this was a problem that her resources couldn't simply overwhelm. "Maybe we should stop," Ethan said quietly. "Not forever. Just long enough to find a lawyer, figure out the legal landscape, do this through proper channels." "Lily walked a quarter mile yesterday," Marianne said. "A quarter mile, Ethan. Without her wheelchair, without stopping to rest. She came home and cried because she couldn't remember the last time she'd been able to just walk to the end of the block and back. And you want me to tell her we're stopping? I want to protect you both from what's coming. These aren't empty threats. The medical board has real power. They can file charges, pursue prosecution, and if they do, I don't just lose my garage, I could lose my daughter." The words hung between them, the reality neither wanted to acknowledge. If Ethan was arrested, convicted, what would happen to Sophie? His parents were gone. He had no siblings except Danny, who was dead. No support system that could take care of a 7-year-old while her father dealt with legal consequences. "I have a lawyer looking into it," Marianne said. "She thinks we have a defense. You didn't perform a medical procedure. You made a mechanical adjustment to a device. It's closer to repairing a wheelchair than practicing medicine." Does she think that argument will work? She thinks it might. If we can show that the modification improved Lily's quality of life without causing harm, if we have documentation from Dr. Mendez supporting this biomechanical rationale, we might be able to argue this falls outside the medical board's jurisdiction. And if we can't? Marianne was quiet for a long moment. Then we fight anyway. Because the alternative is watching my daughter go back to being in pain every moment of every day, and I won't do that. I can't. Ethan understood. He'd made the same calculation with Danny, pushing forward with treatments and therapies that might not work because doing nothing was unbearable. The difference was that with Danny, he'd been fighting a battle that was already lost. With Lily, there was still hope. "Okay," he said. "We keep going, but carefully. Everything documented, everything by the book as much as possible." "There's something else," Marianne said, and her tone shifted slightly. "I want to go public with this, not just fight the legal battle quietly, but actually tell people what happened, how a mechanic in a garage succeeded where 17 specialists failed. Make it harder for them to sweep this under the rug." "That's a terrible idea," Ethan said immediately. "The moment this becomes public, we'll have media attention, scrutiny, people picking apart everything we've done. It'll make the legal situation worse. Or it'll make it harder for them to prosecute without looking like they're punishing someone for helping a disabled girl walk. Public opinion matters, Ethan, even to bureaucrats. It also invites criticism. There will be doctors lining up to explain why what I did was dangerous, why I got lucky, why this can't be replicated. Do you really want to subject Lily to that? I want my daughter to be able to walk without spending the rest of her life wondering when someone's going to take that away from her. If going public helps protect that, then yes, I want to do it." Ethan closed his eyes, trying to imagine what media attention would look like. Reporters showing up at his garage, cameras filming Sophie going to school, his entire life dissected by strangers who'd reduce everything to a feel-good story or a cautionary tale depending on their editorial slant. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "Don't think too long. My lawyer says the medical board is moving fast. If we're going to control the narrative, we need to get ahead of it." After they hung up, Ethan sat in the silence of his garage and tried to figure out how his life had reached this point. 2 months ago, he'd been nobody. A mechanic barely scraping by. A single father trying to raise his daughter. A man with impossible dreams and a notebook full of sketches that would never become real. Now he was potentially facing criminal charges for the crime of noticing something doctors had missed. It would have been funny if it wasn't terrifying. That evening, Sophie asked the question he'd been dreading. Dad, why was that man here today? The one who gave you the envelope? They were eating dinner, spaghetti with sauce from a jar, the same meal they'd had 3 times that week because it was cheap and Sophie didn't complain. Ethan set down his fork and tried to figure out how to explain legal threats to a 7-year-old. He was delivering some papers about my work with Lily. Are you in trouble? Her voice was small, frightened in a way that made Ethan want to find whoever had sent those letters and make them understand what their bureaucratic decisions meant to a little girl who'd already lost her mother and her uncle. Some people think I shouldn't be helping Lily because I'm not a doctor. They're worried I might make a mistake. But you didn't make a mistake. You made her better. I know, sweetheart, but sometimes the rules are more important to people than the results. Sophie processed this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Are they going to make you stop helping her? They're going to try. That's not fair. No, Ethan agreed. It's not fair. She pushed spaghetti around on her plate, and Ethan could see her mind working through implications that a child shouldn't have to consider. If you get in big trouble, what happens to me? The question hit him like a physical blow. This was what kept him up at night, the fear that lived beneath all his other fears. Not what would happen to him, but what would happen to Sophie if he couldn't take care of her. That's not going to happen, he said, trying to sound certain. I promise. But they both knew he couldn't promise that. Not really. Promises were what you made when you had control over outcomes, and Ethan was rapidly losing control over anything. The next morning brought another complication. Ethan was opening the garage when a sedan pulled up, not the Mercedes, but a Honda Accord that had seen better days. A man in his 50s got out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. Are you Ethan Hale? He asked. Yes. I'm Robert Chen. I heard you helped a girl with her leg brace. I was wondering if you could look at mine. Ethan felt ice settle in his stomach. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Please. I've been wearing this thing for 3 years, and it's killing me. My doctor keeps adjusting it, but nothing helps. If you could just take a look. I can't, Ethan said firmly. I'm not a medical professional. What I did for Lily was a one-time thing, and I'm actually being investigated for it right now. Robert's face fell. Oh, I didn't know. I just thought. I heard she was walking now, and I hoped. I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't help you. The man nodded slowly and got back in his car. Ethan watched him drive away and felt sick. How many people like Robert were out there? How many people were suffering with improperly fitted braces, with devices that helped one problem while creating others, with pain that doctors dismissed as inevitable? And how many of them had heard about Lily and were desperate enough to seek help from a mechanic in a garage? By noon, 3 more people had shown up. An elderly woman with a back brace, a teenage boy with a foot orthotic, a middle-aged man with a knee device similar to Lily's. Ethan turned them all away, explaining each time that he couldn't help, that he wasn't qualified, that he was facing legal action for the one case he'd taken on. Their disappointment was crushing. Dr. Mendez called that afternoon. I've been contacted by the medical board, she said without preamble. They want to interview me about my involvement with Lily's case. What are you going to tell them? The truth, that I've been monitoring the situation from a biomechanical engineering perspective, that I've seen measurable improvement in Lily's gait and function, and that in my professional opinion, the modification you made was mechanically sound. Will that help or hurt? I don't know. But Ethan, there's something else. I've been reviewing the data I've collected over the past few weeks, and I think we might have something significant here. The improvement in Lily's case isn't just about fixing one brace, it's about understanding a fundamental flaw in how these devices are designed. Ethan sat down slowly. What do you mean? Most orthotic braces are designed based on static measurements and standardized biomechanical models. But every human body is slightly different. What you did with Lily was adjust the brace to match her specific anatomy and movement patterns. That kind of customization isn't standard practice, partly because it requires the kind of observation and iterative adjustment that our medical system doesn't support well. So you're saying the problem is systemic? I'm saying that there are probably thousands of people wearing braces that don't quite fit right, experiencing chronic pain that could be resolved with the kind of careful, individualized adjustment you provided. But our current system doesn't facilitate that kind of care. Ethan thought about Robert Chen and the others who'd shown up at his garage. What do we do with that information? We publish it. Write up Lily's case as a study, document the modification process and the results, get it peer-reviewed and published in a biomechanical engineering journal. It won't solve the legal problems, but it might change the conversation from mechanic practices medicine illegally to innovative approach to orthotic design shows promise. You really think we could publish this? I think we have to. Because if we don't, the medical board shuts you down, Lily's improvement becomes an anecdote, and nothing changes. But if we can demonstrate that this approach has scientific merit, we might be able to shift the entire discussion. It was the first piece of genuinely good news Ethan had heard in weeks. What do you need from me? Everything, every measurement, every adjustment, every observation. We write this up properly, with rigor and honesty. No exaggeration, no miracle claims, just clear documentation of what was done and what resulted. They spent the next 2 weeks working on the paper. Ethan would close the garage at 6 p.m. and drive to Dr. Mendez's office, where they'd work until midnight organizing data, writing methodology sections, creating charts and graphs that turned Lily's story into something scientific. Marianne provided before and after videos of Lily walking, medical records documenting her history, even testimony from Lily herself about her pain levels and functional improvements. It was exhausting work on top of everything else Ethan was juggling. His regular business was barely surviving. He'd had to let go of the part-time help he could no longer afford, which meant he was doing everything himself. Sophie was spending more time at her friend's house after school because Ethan couldn't always be there when the bus dropped her off. But the paper was coming together. And more than that, it was good. Dr. Mendez kept saying it, her excitement growing as the data revealed patterns and insights that transcended Lily's individual case. They weren't just documenting one successful modification, they were proposing a new approach to orthotic design that prioritized individualized biomechanical analysis over standardized solutions. The third letter arrived on a Friday. This one was from an attorney representing Dr. Raymond Chen personally. It accused Ethan of damaging proprietary medical equipment, claimed that any improvements Lily experienced were coincidental and unsustainable, and demanded compensation for the $47,000 brace that had been vandalized. Ethan showed the letter to Marianne's lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd been handling the medical board correspondence. "This is interesting," Rebecca said, studying the document. "Chen is going after you personally, separate from the medical board action. That suggests he's worried about something." "Worried about what?" "He's a Stanford-trained specialist with decades of experience." "I'm nobody." "You're the person who proved his $47,000 brace was wrong. That's not nothing. If word gets out that a mechanic fixed what he couldn't, it damages his reputation. Maybe damages it enough that other patients start questioning his work." "So this is about protecting his image? This is about protecting his business." Chen consults on orthotic design, testifies in malpractice cases, has lucrative contracts with medical device manufacturers. If your approach proves superior to his, it threatens all of that. Ethan felt anger rising, hot and sharp. So because I might make him look bad, he's trying to destroy me? "Welcome to how the world works when you threaten established interests," Rebecca said dryly. "The good news is that his personal lawsuit might actually help us with the medical board. It demonstrates that at least some of the opposition to what you did is motivated by professional rivalry rather than legitimate safety concerns." "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that we're now fighting a two-front war. The medical board on one side, Chen's personal legal action on the other. Both are expensive to defend against, and both carry serious consequences if we lose." "How expensive?" Rebecca named a figure that made Ethan's vision blur. There was no way he could afford that. Even with Marianne's offer to pay him as a consultant, even if he worked every hour he was awake, he couldn't come close to covering legal fees at that level. "Marianne said she'd help," he said quietly. "And she will. But Ethan, you need to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. When we submit our paper for publication, when this becomes public, you're going to face scrutiny from every direction. Your entire life will be examined. Every decision you've made, every shortcut you've taken, every mistake you've ever committed will be used against you. I know. Do you? Because I've seen cases like this before. Regular people who do something extraordinary and then get destroyed by systems designed to protect credentialed professionals. You could lose everything, your business, your savings, possibly your freedom. And through all of it, you'll be painted as either a reckless amateur who got lucky or a charlatan preying on desperate people. I helped someone, Ethan said, his voice hard. That's all I did. I helped someone who was suffering. I believe you. But belief doesn't win legal battles. Evidence wins legal battles. Documentation, expert testimony, scientific validation. Those things win. Do we have enough of that? Dr. Mendez thinks so. Then we better hope she's right, because if she's not, this ends very badly for you. That night, Ethan lay awake in his small apartment above the garage, listening to Sophie's quiet breathing from the next room and trying to figure out if he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in helping Lily. He couldn't regret that, not when he'd seen her walking freely for the first time in 11 years, but in continuing to push forward when the smart thing would have been to quietly stop, to let Marianne find another professional to work with Lily, to return to being just a mechanic who fixed engines and kept his head down. But he knew why he couldn't do that. It wasn't pride or stubbornness or any desire for recognition. It was the same reason he'd spent 3 years studying anatomy and biomechanics after Danny died. It was the need to prove that his brother's suffering hadn't been meaningless, that the promise he'd made in a hospital room could still be kept, even if Danny wasn't there to see it. And maybe, underneath all of that, it was the need to prove that Ethan Hale was more than what life had reduced him to. More than a failed engineering student, more than a widower barely surviving, more than someone who'd traded dreams for oil changes and brake jobs. He'd helped Lily walk. That mattered. That had to matter enough to justify everything that was coming. The paper was submitted for review 3 weeks later. Dr. Mendez chose the Journal of Biomechanical Engineering, a respected publication that would give their work credibility if accepted. The peer review process could take months, she warned, and there was no guarantee it would be accepted at all. But 2 weeks after submission, Dr. Mendez received an email from the journal's editor. They wanted to fast-track the review. They'd identified 3 reviewers who could provide feedback within a month. The editor, it seemed, recognized that the paper addressed questions of immediate clinical relevance. This is good news, Dr. Mendez told Ethan over the phone. Fast-tracking means they think it's significant. Or it means they want to debunk it quickly, Ethan said. Maybe, but I don't think so. The editor specifically mentioned the detailed documentation and the rigorous methodology. That's what good science looks like, regardless of who's doing it. While they waited for the reviews, life continued its complicated dance between hope and disaster. Lily kept improving, her walking becoming more natural with each session. She'd started physical therapy with a therapist Dr. Mendez recommended, someone willing to work with the modified brace rather than insisting on standard equipment. The progress was remarkable enough that Marianne had started filming short videos, documenting Lily's journey in case they needed additional evidence for the legal battles. But those battles were intensifying. The medical board had scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks out. Dr. Chen's lawsuit was moving forward, with depositions scheduled and discovery requests piling up. Ethan had to hire his own lawyer to handle Chen's case separately from the medical board action, which meant more expenses he couldn't afford. Sophie noticed the stress, even though Ethan tried to hide it. She'd stopped asking for anything beyond absolute necessities, had taken to doing extra chores without being asked, as if by being perfect, she could somehow make her father's problems go away. It broke his heart. "Dad," she said one evening while they were eating another cheap dinner, "if we have to move, that's okay. I don't mind." Ethan set down his fork. "What makes you think we have to move?" "I heard you on the phone, talking about money, about maybe not being able to keep the garage." He'd been so careful to have those conversations after she was asleep. He hadn't realized she'd been listening. "We're not moving, sweetheart, I promise." "You can't promise that." "Not really." She looked at him with eyes too wise for her age. "I know things are hard right now. I know helping Lily is causing problems. But Dad, I think you should keep helping her anyway." "Why?" "Because it's important, and because—" She struggled to find words for something she felt but couldn't quite articulate. "Because you're happy when you're doing it. Not happy like laughing happy, but happy like you matter. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. Out of the mouths of children came the kind of clarity that adults spent years trying to rationalize away. Yeah, baby, that makes sense. The peer reviews came back after 5 weeks. 2 were enthusiastically positive, praising the careful documentation and the insights about individualized orthotic design. The third was more skeptical, questioning whether the results could be replicated and whether the improvement might be temporary. But all 3 recommended publication with minor revisions. Dr. Mendez called Ethan with the news, her voice bright with excitement. We did it. Once we make the revisions, we'll be published in a peer-reviewed journal. That gives us scientific credibility, Ethan. It means this isn't just an anecdote, it's documented, validated research. Will it help with the legal cases? It should. We can present it as evidence that what you did wasn't reckless experimentation, but rather a biomechanically sound intervention based on established principles. It won't make the problems go away, but it gives us ammunition. They submitted the revisions within a week, and the paper was accepted for publication. The journal's editor even mentioned the possibility of writing an accompanying editorial about innovation in orthotic design and the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. It felt like winning, or at least like not losing quite as badly as they could have been. Then came the hearing. The California Medical Board held its proceedings in a sterile conference room in Sacramento. Ethan sat next to Rebecca Torres at a long table, facing a panel of 5 board members who would determine whether he'd violated medical practice statutes. Across the room sat representatives from the board's legal team, along with Dr. Chen himself, present as an expert witness. The proceedings opened with the board's attorney laying out the case. Ethan had modified a medical device without authorization. He had provided ongoing care and adjustment to a patient despite having no medical training. He had, in essence, practiced medicine without a license. The fact that the patient had improved was irrelevant to the question of whether laws had been broken. Rebecca responded with their defense. Ethan had made a mechanical adjustment to a device, work that fell within his expertise as someone who understood biomechanics and engineering principles. He had not diagnosed a condition, prescribed treatment, or performed any medical procedure. He had worked under the oversight of Dr. Patricia Mendez, a qualified biomechanical engineer. And the results spoke for themselves. A patient who'd suffered for 11 years was now walking independently. Then came the witnesses. Dr. Chen testified that the modification was dangerous, that it bypassed safety features built into the original design, that any improvement was likely temporary and could lead to long-term damage. He was polished, confident, credible. Dr. Mendez countered by walking through the biomechanical analysis, showing with data and measurements exactly why the modification had worked. She presented their soon-to-be-published paper as evidence of scientific rigor. She was equally polished, equally confident, equally credible. Finally, Lily testified. Marianne had fought to allow it, arguing that the person most affected by these proceedings deserved to be heard. Lily rolled into the hearing room in her wheelchair. She'd chosen to use it for the proceedings, though she could walk now, and spoke in a clear, steady voice about what her life had been like before Ethan's modification and what it was like now. I was in pain every single day, she said. Every moment. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus in school, couldn't do anything without hurting. My own mother couldn't hug me without causing pain, and 17 specialists told me this was just how my life was going to be. She looked directly at the board members. Ethan didn't promise to cure me. He didn't claim to be a doctor. He just noticed something wrong and offered to try to fix it. And it worked. For the first time in 11 years, I can walk without pain. I can go to school like a normal person. I can have a life. Her voice strengthened. So if you're going to punish him for that, if you're going to make an example of someone who actually helped when the entire medical system failed me, then you need to understand what you're really doing. You're protecting a system that left me suffering for over a decade. You're saying it's better for people like me to stay broken than to let someone without the right credentials try to help. The room was silent when she finished. Even Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable. The board members asked questions, reviewed documentation, and finally adjourned to deliberate. Ethan sat in the hallway with Rebecca, Marianne, and Lily, waiting for a decision that would determine the next chapter of all their lives. After 2 hours, they were called back in. The board chair, A woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes read from a prepared statement. The board had carefully considered the evidence and testimony. They acknowledged that Mr. Hale's intentions appeared to be genuine and that the patient had experienced positive outcomes. However, the modification of medical devices and provision of ongoing care fell into a regulatory gray area that raised legitimate concerns about patient safety and professional boundaries. Ethan's heart sank. Here it came. The punishment, the fines, possibly criminal referral. But the chair continued. Given the unique circumstances of this case, including the oversight provided by Dr. Mendez and the documented positive outcomes, the board had decided not to pursue enforcement action at this time. However, Mr. Hale was formally cautioned against engaging in similar activities in the future without appropriate medical supervision and professional collaboration. It took a moment for the words to sink in. They weren't prosecuting him. They were letting him go with a warning. Rebecca squeezed his arm. "We won," she whispered. Not quite won, Ethan thought. More like survived. But survival counted for something. As they left the building, Marianne was already on her phone, calling her lawyer to see if the board's decision would impact Dr. Chen's personal lawsuit. Lily wheeled alongside Ethan, and when they reached the parking lot, she stood up from the wheelchair and walked to the car under her own power. She turned back to look at him, smiling. "Thank you," she said simply. Those two words, in that moment, felt like justification for everything. Every sleepless night, every legal threat, every moment of fear and doubt. He'd helped someone. Despite every obstacle the system had thrown at him, despite his lack of credentials and resources, he'd helped someone walk again. That evening, Ethan received an email from an unexpected source. It was from a professor at MIT, someone he'd never heard of, who'd somehow learned about Lily's case. The professor was studying accessible medical technology and innovation in low-resource settings. He wanted to know if Ethan would be interested in collaborating on research into simplified orthotic design approaches that could be implemented outside traditional medical systems. It was the first indication that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't ending. Maybe it was just beginning. The email from MIT sat in Ethan's inbox for 3 days before he found the courage to respond. Professor Michael Zhang's offer was both exhilarating and terrifying. Collaboration on research that could legitimize everything Ethan had been doing, but also another commitment when he was already stretched impossibly thin. His garage was hemorrhaging money, Dr. Chen's lawsuit was still pending despite the medical board's decision, and Sophie needed a father who was present, not perpetually distracted by responsibilities that multiplied faster than he could handle them. But the email represented something Ethan hadn't dared to hope for. Validation. Not from bureaucrats issuing warnings or lawyers negotiating settlements, but from someone in the academic world who saw potential in what he'd accomplished, someone who thought a mechanic's insights might actually matter. He finally replied on a Thursday evening after Sophie had gone to bed, his response cautious but honest. He explained his situation, his lack of formal credentials, the legal complications that still shadowed everything he did. He expected Professor Zhang to politely withdraw the offer once confronted with the messy reality of Ethan's circumstances. The response came within an hour. "Mr. Hale, I don't care about credentials. I care about results and innovative thinking. The medical establishment has become so specialized and siloed that we often miss simple solutions because we're too focused on complex ones. What you did with Lily Cole is exactly the kind of practical, patient-centered problem-solving we need more of. I'd still like to talk. Are you available for a video call this weekend?" Ethan read the email twice, then a third time, trying to find the catch. There had to be a catch. People from MIT didn't just invite mechanics to collaborate on research without some ulterior motive. But when the video call happened on Saturday morning, Professor Zhang turned out to be exactly what his emails suggested. A man in his 40s with an infectious enthusiasm for accessible technology and a genuine respect for unconventional approaches to problem solving. He'd read the paper Ethan and Dr. Mendez had published, had watched videos of Lily walking, and had questions that demonstrated he understood the biomechanical principles involved. "The brilliant thing about your modification," Zhang said, gesturing enthusiastically at something off-screen, "is that it's reproducible with basic tools and materials. Most orthotic innovations require expensive equipment and specialized facilities. What you've shown is that careful observation and mechanical adjustment can achieve results comparable to devices costing tens of thousands of dollars. That has massive implications for accessibility. I got lucky, Ethan said, uncomfortable with praise he still didn't feel he deserved. I saw one thing that happened to be fixable. Luck is being prepared when opportunity presents itself. You spent years studying biomechanics. You developed expertise in understanding how mechanical systems work. When the opportunity came, you recognized what others missed because you'd done the preparation. That's not luck. That's the intersection of skill and observation. They talked for over an hour, discussing potential research directions, funding possibilities, and how Ethan's practical experience could complement academic theoretical work. Zhang mentioned grant applications he was preparing, conferences where their collaborative work could be presented, journals that might be interested in case studies documenting low-cost orthotic interventions. It was overwhelming and exciting and completely disconnected from Ethan's daily reality of unpaid bills and legal threats. I appreciate all of this, Ethan said finally, but I need to be honest with you. I'm barely keeping my business afloat. I'm fighting a lawsuit from the doctor whose brace I modified. My daughter is 7 years old and needs a father who can actually be present. I don't know if I have the bandwidth to take on more commitments, even ones this exciting. Zhang nodded, his enthusiasm dimming slightly but not disappearing. I understand. But Ethan, let me ask you something. What happens if you don't pursue this? You go back to just fixing cars, Lily's improvement becomes a footnote, and nothing changes for the thousands of other people suffering with poorly fitted orthotic devices. Is that really what you want? What I want doesn't matter if I can't pay my rent. Then let's figure out how to make it sustainable. I have discretionary research funds I can allocate to consultants. It's not a fortune, but it might be enough to give you breathing room. And if we can secure one of the larger grants I'm applying for, there could be a formal position, research associate, technical consultant, something that provides stable income while you continue this work. It sounded too good to be true, which in Ethan's experience usually meant it was too good to be true. But Zhang seemed genuine, and the possibility of income that didn't depend on how many break jobs he could squeeze into a day was too tempting to dismiss outright. Let me think about it, Ethan said. Of course, but think quickly. The grant application deadline is in 3 weeks, and I'd like to include your work as a core component of the proposal. After the call ended, Ethan sat in his small office and tried to process what had just happened. An MIT professor wanted to collaborate with him. There might be funding, might be a path forward that didn't involve choosing between helping people and keeping the lights on. Sophie appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas. Was that about Lily? Sort of. It's about the work I did with Lily, and maybe doing similar work with other people. She climbed into his lap, something she was getting almost too big for, but that Ethan cherished every time it happened. Are you going to do it? I don't know yet. It would mean more time away from you, more stress, more complications. But more people would get help, like Lily got help. Her simple logic cut through all his complicated rationalizations. Yes, it would be hard. Yes, it would require sacrifices, but more people would get help. Yeah, he said quietly. More people would get help. The decision became easier a week later when Dr. Chen's lawsuit was suddenly withdrawn. No explanation, just a terse letter from his attorney stating that the plaintiff was discontinuing legal action. Rebecca Torres called with the news, clearly as surprised as Ethan was. This is unusual, she said. Chen was pushing hard, demanding compensation, threatening to pursue this all the way to trial. Something made him back off. Marianne had the answer when Ethan called her. I may have had a conversation with some people at Stanford, she said, her tone carefully neutral. People who sit on the medical school's advisory board. People who donate generously to the university's research programs. I simply mentioned that it would be unfortunate if Stanford became known as the institution that persecuted someone for helping a disabled girl walk. You threatened them. I made them aware of how the optics might look. Stanford prides itself on innovation and patient care. A lawsuit against someone who succeeded where their specialist failed doesn't align with that brand. Chen was encouraged to reconsider his position. Ethan didn't know whether to be grateful or uncomfortable with the casual deployment of power and influence. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You gave my daughter her life back, Ethan. Protecting you from legal harassment is the least I can do." With Chen's lawsuit gone, the weight on Ethan's shoulders lifted slightly. Not completely. He was still broke, still overwhelmed, still facing a dozen impossible challenges, but the threat of financial destruction through legal fees had diminished, and that was something. He called Professor Zhang and said yes to the collaboration. The next 3 months were a blur of activity that pushed Ethan to his absolute limits. He worked with Zhang on grant applications, documenting his methods and observations in language that satisfied academic reviewers. He continued seeing Lily twice a week, fine-tuning her brace as her strength and confidence grew. He took on a few other patients, carefully, with Dr. Mendez's oversight and proper documentation, people who'd heard about Lily and were desperate enough to try an unconventional approach. There was Marcus, a veteran whose prosthetic knee had never quite fit right, causing pain that VA doctors attributed to phantom limb syndrome. Ethan adjusted the alignment of the socket and the positioning of the knee joint, changes that took 4 sessions and resulted in Marcus walking without a limp for the first time in 3 years. There was Elena, a teenager with cerebral palsy whose ankle brace restricted movement so severely that she'd developed chronic hip pain. Ethan modified the brace to allow more natural articulation while maintaining the support her ankle needed, and within weeks her hip pain had decreased by half. Each case was different, each required careful observation and iterative adjustment, and each added to the growing body of evidence that there was something systematic about what Ethan was doing. It wasn't magic or luck. It was careful biomechanical analysis applied to individual patients rather than standardized models. Dr. Mendez documented everything, building a database of cases that would form the foundation for future research. And slowly, grudgingly, other professionals began to take notice. A physical therapist in San Diego started referring patients to Ethan. An orthopedic surgeon at Scripps, younger and less invested in defending established practices than Dr. Morrison, asked to observe Ethan's work and came away impressed. The tide was turning, but it was slow and exhausting and required Ethan to be everything to everyone. He was father to Sophie, mechanic to his remaining customers, biomechanical consultant to patients, research collaborator to Professor Zhang, and increasingly, the face of an unconventional approach that challenged how orthotic care was traditionally delivered. Sophie bore the brunt of his divided attention. She was patient, uncomplaining, too mature for her age in ways that made Ethan ache with guilt. Her teachers mentioned that she seemed tired in class. She stopped inviting friends over because she knew her father was always too busy. She made her own dinners on nights when Ethan worked late and left plates wrapped in foil for him to find when he finally came home. It couldn't continue like this. Something had to give. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Ethan arrived home at 9 p.m. to find Sophie asleep at the kitchen table, her homework half finished beside her. She'd waited for him, tried to stay awake, and finally surrendered to exhaustion with a pencil still in her hand. Ethan stood in the doorway and felt something crack inside him. This wasn't sustainable. This wasn't fair to Sophie, who'd already lost her mother and deserved better than a father who was physically present but emotionally and temporally absent. He carried Sophie to bed, tucked her in, and sat in the dark kitchen trying to figure out how to be everything he needed to be. The answer, he finally acknowledged, was that he couldn't. Not alone. The next morning he called Marianne. "I need help," he said without preamble. "Not money. Help. I can't do all of this by myself anymore." "What do you need?" "I don't even know. Someone to help run the garage so I can focus on the orthotic work. Someone to help with Sophie when I'm working late. Someone to handle the administrative stuff that's drowning me. I can't keep all these plates spinning." Marianne was quiet for a moment. "Let me make some calls." Within a week, she'd found solutions Ethan would never have been able to arrange himself. A retired mechanic named Frank, the same Frank who'd originally trained Ethan, agreed to come back part-time to help with the garage work. Marianne hired an administrative assistant who could handle scheduling, documentation, and the endless paperwork that came with the orthotic consultations. She even arranged for Sophie to attend an after-school program at the community center, one with homework help and activities that meant Sophie wasn't sitting alone waiting for her father. "This is too much," Ethan protested when Marianne showed him the arrangement she'd made. "This is what's necessary," she corrected. "You can't help people if you're collapsing from exhaustion. And Sophie deserves a childhood, not to be a parentified child taking care of herself because her father is trying to save the world. The changes made an immediate difference. With Frank handling routine auto repairs, Ethan could focus on the orthotic work without feeling like he was neglecting his business. With administrative support, he wasn't drowning in paperwork and scheduling conflicts. And with Sophie in a program where she was engaged and supervised, Ethan didn't spend every moment worrying about whether she was okay. For the first time in months, Ethan could breathe. Professor Zhang's grant application was successful. The NIH awarded funding for a 3-year study on accessible orthotic interventions, with Ethan named as a research consultant at a salary that, while modest by academic standards, was more stable income than he'd had in years. The grant included funding for equipment, materials, and overhead that would allow Ethan to formalize his work without depending on charity or burning through savings he didn't have. The news came on a Friday afternoon. Ethan read the award letter 3 times, then called Sophie at the community center. "Sweetheart, we're going to be okay," he said when she answered. "I know, Dad. We were always going to be okay." Her absolute faith in him was humbling and heartbreaking in equal measure. That evening, Ethan took Sophie out for dinner at a real restaurant. Not fast food, but an actual sit-down place with menus and waiters. It was a small celebration, but it felt monumental, a marker of having survived the worst and emerged into something that might actually be sustainable. "Dad," Sophie said over her spaghetti and meatballs, "I'm proud of you." "Yeah?" "Yeah. You helped a lot of people, and you didn't give up even when things were really hard." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, you know. You were so strong through all of this. I learned from you." The simplicity of that statement, the matter-of-fact way she said it, made Ethan's eyes sting. He'd been so worried about failing her, about being an inadequate parent, about not providing the stable, comfortable childhood she deserved. But maybe what she needed wasn't perfection. Maybe what she needed was to see her father trying, struggling, persisting through difficulty because it mattered. Maybe that was enough. 8 months after the medical board hearing, Ethan stood in a converted warehouse space that had once been a furniture store. The building sat 3 blocks from his garage, close enough to walk, but separate enough to establish clear boundaries between his automotive work and his orthotic consultations. Grant money had funded the renovation, transforming empty space into a modest rehabilitation center with proper examination areas, equipment for gait analysis, and a workshop where Ethan could fabricate and modify braces. The sign outside read, "Hale Biomechanics Center." It felt presumptuous every time Ethan saw it, but Dr. Mendez had insisted. "You need to own what you've built," she'd said. "Stop apologizing for having expertise." Lily was there for the informal opening, walking through the space with the easy confidence of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to move through the world in pain. She'd started her senior year of high school, was applying to colleges, was living the normal teenage life that had been stolen from her at age 6. "This is amazing," she said, examining the gait analysis equipment. "You're going to help so many people here." "We'll try," Ethan said. "No promises, no guarantees, just careful work and honest effort." "That's all anyone can ask." Marianne stood nearby, watching her daughter move freely through the space, and Ethan saw tears gathering in her eyes. She caught him looking and smiled. "I keep waiting for this to feel real," she said quietly. "For almost 12 years, pain was just Lily's reality, and now it's not. I still can't quite believe it." "Believe it?" Ethan said. She did the hard work, the walking, the physical therapy, the persistence even when progress was slow. "All I did was adjust some metal." "You did more than that. You saw what needed to be seen. You cared enough to try when everyone else had given up. That matters more than you know." The center officially opened the following week. Ethan had 4 patients scheduled for that first day, all referrals from Dr. Mendez or the handful of medical professionals who'd become supporters of his work. He approached each case with the same careful methodology he'd developed with Lily. Observe, measure, analyze, adjust, reassess. Nothing dramatic, nothing miraculous, just patient attention to the relationship between devices and the bodies they were meant to serve. Not everyone improved. Some conditions were beyond what mechanical adjustment could address. Some patients had structural damage or neurological issues that no brace modification could resolve. Ethan learned to recognize the limits of his approach, to refer people to appropriate medical specialists when their needs exceeded what he could provide. But more people improved than didn't. And those successes, documented carefully and shared through academic publications and professional networks, gradually changed the conversation about orthotic care. Professor Zhang visited 6 months after the center opened, bringing with him 2 graduate students who were studying accessible medical technology. They spent a week observing Ethan's work, documenting his methods, interviewing patients about their experiences. Zhang was particularly interested in how Ethan's approach differed from traditional orthotic fitting. "You spend hours with each patient," Zhang observed. "Multiple sessions, iterative adjustments. The standard model is to fit the device and send them home with maybe one follow-up. Why don't more practitioners work the way you do?" "Time and money," Ethan said simply. "The medical system doesn't reimburse for the kind of careful, ongoing attention this requires. It's more profitable to fit devices quickly and move on to the next patient. And honestly, a lot of practitioners don't think this level of customization is necessary. They trust the standardized models and don't look deeper when patients report ongoing problems. So the system incentivizes speed over quality. The system incentivizes what gets reimbursed, and insurance companies want efficiency, not perfection." It was a frustrating reality that Ethan couldn't change. His center operated partly outside the traditional insurance model, charging fees that were lower than standard orthotic consultations, but that insurance often wouldn't cover because his credentials didn't fit their approved provider categories. Some patients paid out of pocket. Others received care subsidized by grant funding. It wasn't a sustainable long-term model, but it worked for now. The research continued. Ethan and Dr. Mendez published 3 more papers documenting their approach and outcomes. They presented at conferences, gave workshops teaching other practitioners their methods, and slowly built a network of professionals who believed that orthotic care could be better than it was. There was resistance, of course. Established manufacturers didn't appreciate suggestions that their expensive devices needed modification. Some medical professionals viewed Ethan as a threat or a fraud, someone without credentials pretending to expertise he didn't have. The criticism stung, but Ethan had learned to focus on results rather than recognition. Sophie turned 8, then 9. She was thriving in school, making friends, living the stable childhood that Ethan had worried he couldn't provide. She still helped in the garage sometimes, still watched her father work with patients, and asked questions about biomechanics and anatomy. Ethan wondered sometimes if she'd follow him into this work, if his unconventional path might inspire her own. But mostly, he just wanted her to be happy, to have choices he'd never had, to build whatever life made sense for her. A year after the center opened, Ethan received a call from a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She was an orthopedic surgeon at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and she'd heard about his work through Dr. Mendez. "I have a patient," she said, "a 9-year-old boy with a complex lower limb deformity. We've done multiple surgeries, tried every standard orthotic intervention, and he's still in significant pain. I know this is unusual, but would you be willing to consult?" "Of course. Send me his records and we'll see if there's anything I can contribute." The boy's name was James, and his case was heartbreaking. Multiple congenital abnormalities had resulted in legs that didn't quite work right, surgeries that had improved function but hadn't eliminated pain, and a childhood defined by hospitals and procedures and limitations. His parents were exhausted, running out of hope, much like Marianne had been when she first brought Lily to Ethan's garage. Ethan studied the records, consulted with Dr. Mendez, and agreed to see James. The first session was mostly observation, watching how he moved, understanding how his current braces were helping and hurting, taking careful measurements of joint angles and force distribution. The second session, Ethan made a small adjustment. Just one, a modification to how the ankle brace connected to the knee support. James walked across the room, stopped, looked at his mother with wide eyes. "It doesn't pinch," he said. Such a small thing. It doesn't pinch. But for a 9-year-old who'd been pinched and prodded and hurt by medical interventions his entire life, it was everything. Over the next 3 months, Ethan worked with James the way he'd worked with Lily, carefully, incrementally, always asking for feedback, always willing to reverse course if something didn't help. Dr. Mitchell observed some of the sessions, asking questions, trying to understand what Ethan was seeing that multiple surgeons had missed. "You're not just looking at the anatomy," she said during one session. "You're looking at how the anatomy interacts with the device in motion. We tend to evaluate things statically, take measurements when the patient is standing still, fit the brace based on those measurements. But you're analyzing the dynamic relationship. Things work differently when they're moving," Ethan said. "A joint that looks aligned when someone's standing might be completely out of alignment when they're walking. The brace needs to accommodate that motion, not restrict it." It seemed obvious to him, but Dr. Mitchell shook her head in wonder. "We've been trained to think in static terms: X-rays, CT scans, measurements taken with patients lying down or standing still. Your entire approach is based on observation during movement. That's a completely different paradigm." James improved. Not as dramatically as Lily had. His structural issues were more complex, but enough that his pain decreased significantly and his mobility increased. His parents cried when he ran across the hospital hallway during a follow-up appointment, something he hadn't been able to do without falling in over a year. Dr. Mitchell became an advocate, referring other patients and speaking about Ethan's work at professional conferences. She was credentialed, respected, impossible to dismiss as a charlatan or enthusiast. Her endorsement opened doors that would have remained closed to Ethan alone. More patients came. More practitioners reached out. The center expanded, adding staff, a physical therapist who specialized in working with modified orthotic devices, an administrative coordinator who could handle the increasing complexity of scheduling and documentation. Dr. Mendez took a partial sabbatical from teaching to work more closely with the center, turning their collaboration into something that resembled a true research partnership. Ethan hired carefully, looking for people who understood that this work was about patients first and professional ego second. People who were comfortable with uncertainty, willing to admit when they didn't know something, committed to careful observation rather than defaulting to standard protocols. It was 2 years after the center's opening when Ethan received a letter that made him sit down in shock. It was from the California Medical Board, the same organization that had investigated him, threatened prosecution, forced him to defend his right to help people. But this letter wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. The board was convening a task force to examine orthotic device regulations and best practices. They were looking for diverse perspectives, including practitioners with unconventional approaches. Would Ethan be willing to serve on the task force? He called Rebecca Torres, still half expecting this to be some kind of trap. "It's legitimate," she confirmed after reviewing the letter. "They want your input. Probably because your work has gained enough credibility that ignoring you would look worse than including you. Should I do it? Do you want to shape the regulations that govern this field, or do you want to keep operating in the margins?" When she put it that way, the answer was obvious. Ethan joined the task force, attending quarterly meetings in Sacramento where he sat alongside orthopedic surgeons, biomedical engineers, medical device manufacturers, and patient advocates. It was strange being in rooms with people who'd once viewed him as a threat, discussing policy and standards and best practices. But Ethan discovered that he had something valuable to contribute. His perspective was different, grounded in practical observation rather than theoretical models, focused on individual patient outcomes rather than standardized protocols. He pushed for regulations that would allow more individualized approaches, that would recognize expertise developed through practice and observation, even when it didn't come with traditional credentials. Not everyone agreed with him. There were heated debates, philosophical disagreements about the balance between safety and innovation, between protecting patients and protecting professional boundaries. But the conversations were happening, and that mattered. Sophie was 11 when Ethan took her to the beach for the first time in months. They'd been so busy, him with the center and the task force, her with school and soccer and the science club she'd joined, that they'd neglected the simple pleasure of being together without purpose or agenda. They walked along the shore, Sophie running ahead to examine tide pools, while Ethan followed at a slower pace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something like peace. His phone buzzed. A text from Marianne with a video attachment. He opened it and saw Lily walking across a college campus, books under her arm, laughing with friends as they headed toward a building. She was a freshman at UC San Diego now, studying biomedical engineering, determined to understand the science behind what had given her life back. The video ended with Lily turning toward the camera, giving a thumbs up and a smile that radiated joy. Ethan watched it twice, then put his phone away and looked at his daughter, who was calling him over to see a starfish she'd found. This was what mattered, not the awards or recognition or professional validation that had started to accumulate. Not the papers published or the task force meetings or the expanding reputation of the center. Those things were good. They enabled the work to continue, but they weren't the point. The point was Lily walking across a campus, living a life she'd been told was impossible. The point was James running down a hospital hallway. The point was every patient who came to the center in pain and left with even a small measure of relief. The point was keeping the promise Ethan had made in a hospital room 3 years ago, the promise to never give up on people who still had hope. He'd kept that promise. Not perfectly, not without mistakes and setbacks and moments of doubt. But he'd kept it. And in keeping it, he'd discovered that the life he'd thought was reduced to oil changes and brake jobs had actually been preparing him for something else. All those hours studying anatomy, all those nights sketching designs that seemed pointless, all that time observing and learning and trying to understand how things worked, it had all mattered. He'd mattered. Not because of credentials or recognition, but because he'd been willing to see what others missed and try what others dismissed. Sophie came running back with the starfish, breathless with excitement. "Dad, look! It's huge!" Ethan examined the starfish with appropriate seriousness, then helped her return it to the tide pool where it belonged. They walked further down the beach, hand in hand, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Behind them, the city lights were starting to glow. Somewhere in that sprawl was the garage where this had all started, where a luxury car had broken down and brought Marianne and Lily Cole into Ethan's life. Somewhere was the center where patients came seeking help and usually found at least some measure of it. Somewhere was Sophie's school, the task force offices in Sacramento, the hospital where James and other children were learning to move without pain. It was a complicated, messy, imperfect constellation of interconnected lives and choices. But it was real. It was meaningful. It was proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they paid attention and cared enough to try. "Dad?" Sophie asked, looking up at him in the fading light. "Yeah, sweetheart? Do you think you'll always do this? Help people with their braces?" Ethan considered the question. A year ago, he would have said he didn't know, that the future was too uncertain to predict. But now, with the center established and the work continuing and the promise kept over and over with each new patient, he could answer honestly. "As long as there are people who need help, and I have something to offer, yeah, I think I will." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because you're really good at it." They stood together at the water's edge, watching waves roll in and retreat in their eternal rhythm. The ocean was dark now, mysterious and vast, but the shore beneath their feet was solid. Known. Home. Ethan thought about Lily, walking freely across her college campus. He thought about all the patients who would come to the center tomorrow and next week and next month, each carrying their own pain and their own hope. He thought about Sophie, growing up watching her father persist through difficulty because it mattered. And he thought about Danny, whose death had sparked a promise that had changed everything. Danny who'd never walk again, but whose suffering hadn't been meaningless because it had driven Ethan to ensure others wouldn't suffer the same way. The promise had been kept, not just once with Lily, but over and over, with each person who walked out of the center with less pain than they'd walked in with. Real miracles, Ethan had learned, weren't sudden or dramatic. They were built through persistence, care, and the refusal to give up. They were constructed from careful observation and mechanical adjustment and hours of patient iteration. They were made real by ordinary hands doing extraordinary work, not because those hands were special, but because they were willing to try. As the stars multiplied overhead and the sound of the ocean filled the night, Ethan squeezed his daughter's hand and turned back toward the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to keep the promise. But tonight, he could simply be a father walking on the beach with his daughter, grateful for the journey that had brought them here. Hope, after all, didn't just sit and wait. It walked forward on legs that remembered how, carrying people toward futures they'd been told were impossible, proving again and again that sometimes the most important miracles were the ones built step by careful step in garages and rehabilitation centers by people who refused to accept that broken meant forever. The story didn't end here. It continued with every patient who learned to walk without pain, with every practitioner who adopted more individualized approaches, with every regulation that made space for innovation alongside safety. It continued in Lily's footsteps across her campus, in James's run down a hallway, in countless moments of relief and possibility that rippled out from one mechanic's decision to pay attention and care. But for now, in this moment, Ethan could simply walk with his daughter toward their car, knowing that the promise made in grief had been transformed into something hopeful, something that would continue walking forward long after this particular sunset faded into memory. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.